Corinne Belrose's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade, loud enough for everyone to hear, quiet enough to sound like she wasn't trying. Someone let the pie girl in through the front door again. Laughter rippled through silk and wool. Maeve Hollowell stood there holding an empty delivery basket, her worn boots still damp from the snow outside, and felt every single pair of eyes in the Silver Heart Hotel find her at exactly the same moment. She had delivered 12 pies to this banquet. 12. Each one made before sunrise, crimped by hand, carried through a Montana winter evening because a family needed the income and she needed to keep the lights on. And this was her reward. If that were you standing in that ballroom, laughed at by people who never had to count coins before bed, what would you have done? Stay with me until the end of this story. If it moves you, subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next, and hit that like button right now. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Silver Heart Hotel was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel like they had made a wrong turn somewhere in their lives. Maeve had been inside it exactly 4 times, and every single time she had used the service entrance on the north side of the building, the one with the broken latch that stuck in cold weather and required a shoulder bump to open. She knew the rhythm of that door. She knew the smell of the kitchen hallway, tallow candles, roasting meat, the particular wood smoke scent of the big iron stove. She knew to keep her eyes down and move quickly and not let the hotel staff catch her lingering. Tonight she had miscalculated. The kitchen boy, who usually met her at the service door, was sick, and the sous chef, who replaced him, had waved her toward the main corridor instead, distracted by something burning on the stove, and Maeve had followed the sound of voices without thinking. And then she was standing at the edge of the Silver Heart's main ballroom, with a wicker basket hanging from her arm and 12 empty pie tins stacked inside it. And the entire winter banquet of Red Willow's cattle elite was staring directly at her. There were probably 60 people in that room. Maeve was wearing her second-best dress, which was not very good at all. Brown wool, practical stitching, a collar that had been mended twice along the left seam. She had put her hair up that morning with pins she'd had since her mother died, and she had been proud of how neat she looked when she left the house at 4 in the afternoon. She was not proud now. She turned to find the hallway again. "Oh, look," Corinne Belrose said. "Someone let the pie girl in through the front door again." Maeve stopped walking. She should not have stopped. Every rational thought, she had said, "Keep moving. Don't give it weight. The door is 10 feet behind you." But something in Corinne's voice, the absolute comfort of it, the way a person sounds when they have never once worried about whether they belong somewhere, stopped Maeve's feet before her mind could argue. The laughter came in waves. Not everyone laughed, maybe a third of the room. But a third of 60 people in a chandelier-lit ballroom is still 20 voices, and 20 voices all finding the same thing funny at your expense is its own particular kind of violence. Corinne Belrose was 24 years old and had never delivered anything to anyone in her life. She wore a green gown that cost more than Maeve earned in 3 months, and her hair was pinned with pearl-topped combs. And she stood near the fireplace with a crystal glass in her hand and a smile on her face that did not reach her eyes, because it was not that kind of smile. "I believe deliveries are made at the rear entrance," Corinne continued, addressing no one in particular, which meant she was addressing everyone. "There are signs posted, though I suppose not everyone reads them." Maeve's face went hot. She was 28 years old. She had been managing her own household since she was 17. She kept accounts for 11 families in and around Red Willow who could not afford a real bookkeeper. She had nursed her aunt through 2 winters of failing health. She had done all of it without asking Corinne Belrose or anyone like her for a single thing. And she was standing here being talked about like a stray dog that had wandered in from the cold. "I was leaving," Maeve said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "My apologies for the confusion. Do take your basket," Corinne said pleasantly. "Perhaps use the appropriate entrance next time." One more step toward the door, and then the room changed. It changed the way a room does when someone important enters it, not with noise, but with a kind of pressure shift, the way air moves differently before a weather front arrives. Conversations dropped, heads turned. Even Corinne stopped speaking mid-breath. Rourke Halstead walked through the main door of the Silver Heart Hotel ballroom, and the room rearranged itself around him without his asking. Maeve had seen Rourke Halstead twice before in her life, at a distance both times, and both times she had received the same impression. Large man. Serious. No patience for anything decorative. He was 40 years old and built like someone who had done hard physical work for 20 of those years, and then kept doing it out of habit after it stopped being necessary. He had dark hair going gray at the edges, and a jaw that looked like it had been set at some point and never fully softened. He wore a good coat, not the finest coat in the room, and he wore it the way a man wears something useful rather than something meant to impress. He walked in. His eyes moved across the room. They found Maeve. Stayed there. Maeve did not understand why. She was standing at the wrong end of the room, holding empty pie tins, and the most powerful rancher in the Red Willow Valley was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has been searching for and just found in an unexpected place. Then Rourke Halstead walked toward her, not toward the fire. Not toward Thaddeus Belrose, who was standing near the window with his hand already extended in greeting. Not toward the long table where Red Willow's wealthiest men had arranged themselves by net worth. Toward Maeve, directly, without hesitation, crossing the entire length of the ballroom while 60 people watched him do it. Corinne went very still. Rourke stopped in front of Maeve. He was close enough that she could see the weather lines around his eyes. He smelled like cold air and horses, and the particular kind of leather and wool that men who work outdoors always carry with them. He looked at her for one moment that felt very long, and then he took her hand. Maeve's basket almost hit the floor. She caught it by instinct. Rourke's hand was warm and calloused and gripped hers like it was something he had done before, which it absolutely was not, because Maeve had never spoken a single word to this man in her life. "I'm sorry I'm late," Rourke said. His voice was low. It was directed at her, but it carried. "I got held up on the North Road." Maeve opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Rourke turned to face the room without releasing her hand. He did it the way a man turns to face something he is not afraid of, which in this case was 60 people, a banker who clearly wanted to ask questions, and his own unannounced decision. "I believe most of you have not yet had the opportunity to meet my wife," Rourke said. The silence that followed was so complete that Maeve could hear the fire in the grate. Corinne Belrose's crystal glass tilted slightly in her hand. She corrected it, but not before Maeve saw it happen. Thaddeus Belrose, broad, silver-haired, the most financially dangerous man in the county, went very carefully expressionless. That was interesting. Maeve filed it away without knowing why. Several people started talking at once. Rourke did not participate in that conversation. He looked at Maeve again, and whatever he saw on her face, probably pure unfiltered shock, made something shift behind his eyes. Not quite apology, not quite regret, something more complicated than either of those things. "Shall we step out for a moment?" he asked, and his voice was quiet enough now that only she could hear it. "I owe you an explanation. You owe me considerably more than that," Maeve said. His mouth did something. She wasn't sure it was a smile. "Maybe the beginning of one. Yes," he said, "I expect I do." They walked out together. Maeve was aware of every eye in the room following them. She was aware of Corinne standing frozen near the fireplace, with an expression that had gone somewhere beyond embarrassment into something harder and colder. She was aware of the basket still hanging from her arm because she did not have a free hand to put it down. And some part of her brain that had apparently decided to be unhelpful chose this exact moment to worry about leaving the empty pie tins behind. She kept walking. The hotel lobby was empty and cold away from the ballroom heat. Rourke released her hand as soon as they were through the door. Without the contact, Maeve became suddenly aware of how fast her heart was beating. She turned to face him. "You have 30 seconds, she said. And then I need you to understand that I will raise my voice loud enough for every person in that room to hear me if I don't like what I'm hearing." Rourke looked at her steadily. "That's fair. Start talking." He did. What Rourke Halstead told Maeve Hollowell in the cold lobby of the Silverheart Hotel took considerably longer than 30 seconds, and by the end of it, Maeve had set her basket down on a side table because her arm was tired, and she was staring at a point somewhere past his shoulder while her mind worked through the implications of everything she had just heard. Rourke's father had made a deal with Thaddeus Belrose 12 years ago, a financial arrangement built on emergency credit during a drought year. When the Blackthorn Basin herd was dying, and Rourke's father had been too proud to sell off cattle early and too desperate to turn down the only money being offered. The terms included a clause that Rourke had only discovered 6 months ago when he finally dug through the entirety of his father's old paperwork. Unless Rourke Halstead was legally married before the 1st of April, Belrose had the legal right to assume control of Blackthorn Basin's river, access the watershed rights that kept every acre of the ranch viable. Without the river rights, the cattle died. Without the cattle, the ranch collapsed. Without the ranch, dozens of families who depended on Blackthorn Basin employment had nothing. "The 1st of April," Maeve repeated. 11 weeks from now," Rourke said. "And your solution was to walk into a banquet and announce that a woman you have never met is your wife. I was aware you would be making a delivery tonight." He said it flatly, like the admission cost him something. "I looked for an opportunity. The timing was—" "What you did back there," Maeve interrupted, "was use me." He did not argue with that. She would learn later that this was one of the few reliable things about Rourke Halstead. He would not argue with accurate statements, even when they were unpleasant. "Yes," he said, "you walked across that room in front of 60 people, knowing I couldn't exactly contradict you without making a scene and making myself look worse than your announcement already did. Also accurate. And now you're asking me to what exactly?" "1 year," Rourke said. "A legal marriage, properly filed. Long enough to satisfy the terms of the agreement. At the end of the year, we part ways, and I ensure that whatever terms we agree on tonight are fully honored." He paused. "I will clear your mortgage on the house on Larimer Street. All of it, and I will cover your aunt's medical expenses for the duration." Maeve went quiet. She had not told anyone about the mortgage on the Larimer Street house, because the mortgage on the Larimer Street house was the kind of thing that, if people in Red Willow knew about it, would become a whole different kind of problem for her. She had 6 months before she missed a payment, 8 maybe, if she was very careful. After that, she did not have a plan. The fact that Rourke Halstead knew about it told her something. He had done research. He had chosen her the way a man chooses a tool, by assessing its reliability and its cost. That should have made her angrier than anything else he had said. She was angry, but she was also doing arithmetic in her head that she didn't particularly want to be doing. Aunt Ruth's lung treatments were running $6 a month and climbing. The Larimer Street mortgage was $400, which was, at Maeve's current income, approximately $400 more than she had. She had been keeping the accounts for 11 families, but 2 of those families were behind on paying her, and she hadn't said anything about it because they were struggling too, and she couldn't bring herself to push. She had been awake until nearly midnight for the past 3 weeks, working through how to make the numbers work. They did not work. "How did you know about the mortgage?" she asked. Rourke was quiet for a moment. "I have my ways." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It isn't," I asked around discreetly. "About me specifically, yes. Why me?" This question seemed to require more from him than the others. He took a breath. "You have a reputation," he said, "for being trustworthy. People who've had nothing to gain from speaking well of you do so anyway. The minister, the sheriff's wife, 3 families I know of whose books you've been keeping for less than you should charge." He paused. "A fraudulent marriage requires someone whose character won't be questioned." "I needed someone decent, and I was cheap," Maeve said. "I'm not insulted," she said. "I'm just making sure I understand the transaction." She looked at him directly. He did not look away. If I agree to this, how exactly does it work? They talked for another 40 minutes in that cold lobby while the banquet continued without them. Maeve asked questions. Rourke answered them plainly, without embellishment, without sales pressure. He told her what Belrose's legal claim was. He told her what the marriage would need to look like on paper and in practice. He told her what he could and could not promise. He did not tell her everything she would only understand that much later, but what he told her that night, he told her honestly. At some point, Maeve picked up her basket again. She was not sure why. Something to hold, maybe. I need until morning, she said finally. Rourke nodded, one sharp inclination of his head. I have a room here tonight. Send word before 7. He turned to go back inside. Mr. Halstead, Maeve said. He stopped. Whatever I decide, she said. Don't do that again. Don't make a choice for me in public without asking first. I don't care what the pressure is or what the timing looks like. You ask me. Do you understand? Something moved through his expression that she couldn't name. Understood, he said. He went back inside. Maeve stood in the lobby alone for a moment. Then she picked up her basket, found the service corridor, went out through the kitchen into the Montana night, and walked home through 3 inches of new snow with the weight of what she was considering pressing down on her with every step. Her aunt was awake when Maeve came in, which was not unusual. Ruth slept poorly now, had for 2 years. She was sitting up in bed with a shawl around her shoulders and a lamp burning on the nightstand, reading a novel she had already read twice before. She looked up when Maeve came in and immediately read something in Maeve's face. Sit down, Ruth said. Maeve sat on the edge of the bed. She put the basket on the floor. Tell me, Ruth said. So Maeve told her, all of it, Corinne's voice carrying across the ballroom, Rourke's hand finding hers, the cold lobby, and 40 minutes of the most uncomfortable negotiation of her life. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was a thing Ruth was capable of when it mattered. When Maeve finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. He chose you because you're decent, Ruth said. He chose me because I'm in debt and desperate, Maeve corrected. Being decent was a bonus. Ruth's mouth pulled sideways. Those 2 things are not mutually exclusive. She looked at Maeve carefully. What does your gut say? Maeve thought about that. My gut says this is the most reckless thing I would ever agree to in my life. That's not what I asked. My gut also says that man is not a liar. She paused. He's hiding something. I don't know what yet, but the things he said tonight, he meant them. Ruth nodded slowly. And the numbers. Maeve didn't answer that directly, which was its own kind of answer. Ruth knew the mortgage. Ruth knew the treatment costs. Ruth knew. I don't want you doing this for me, Ruth said quietly. I know, Maeve said, but I'm also doing it for the house. And because I am very tired of being the woman who walked in through the wrong door. She did not sleep that night. At 6:45 in the morning, Maeve put on her best coat and walked to the Silver Heart Hotel and sent word up to Rourke Halstead's room. By 8 o'clock, they were in a lawyer's office. And by the time the sun was fully up over the Red Willow Valley, Maeve Hollowell was on paper legally, with signatures and witnesses and everything that made it binding the wife of a man she did not know. She told herself it was a business arrangement. She told herself 1 year was not very long. She told herself she had done harder things than this and survived them. She was right about all of it. She was also, in ways she could not yet see, entirely wrong. The morning Maeve arrived at Blackthorn Basin, it was 17 degrees and the wind was coming off the northern range in long, flat sheets that cut straight through wool. She had 1 trunk. It was not a large trunk. It held her winter clothes, her account books, 3 novels, her mother's sewing kit, and a framed photograph of Ruth taken 7 years ago, when Ruth was still well enough to stand in a garden and smile at a camera without it exhausting her. Maeve had packed it the way a person packs when they are not entirely sure they are coming back carefully, with attention to what actually mattered, without sentimentality about the rest. The ranch hand who drove the wagon said his name was Clem. He was maybe 60, weathered down to something lean and economical, and he did not ask her questions on the 40-minute ride from town. She appreciated that more than she could say. Blackthorn Basin itself appeared gradually as they came around a long ridge, first the fence lines, then the outbuildings, then the main house emerging from the gray winter morning, like something that had been standing there long enough to become part of the landscape rather than something built on top of it. It was not what she had expected. She had expected something that announced itself. Something that said wealth in the way wealthy things usually said it. Instead, the house was large and plain, and looked like it had been repaired in sections over decades by men who were more concerned with keeping it standing than making it look impressive. There was a section of new roof on the east wing. The porch railing on the south side had been replaced with wood that didn't quite match the original. The window frames needed paint. Maeve filed all of this away without comment. Rourke was not there when she arrived. Clem told her without being asked that Mr. Halstead had been on the North Range since, before dawn, there were cattle that had gotten through a fence break in the night, and he'd gone out with 2 hands to find them. This told Maeve something she hadn't known before. Rourke Halstead went out himself. He didn't send men for the inconvenient work and wait by the fire. The housekeeper met Maeve at the door. Her name was Agatha Fenwick, and she was 63 years old, and she had a face like someone who had heard every possible excuse in the world at least twice and found all of them wanting. She looked at Maeve with the specific expression of a woman conducting an assessment she would not share the results of until she was good and ready. "Your room is upstairs," Agatha said, "second door on the left. It has its own stove, and I've kept it lit since yesterday." A pause. Mr. Halstead said, "You were to have whatever you needed." "What I need right now," Maeve said, "is probably a cup of coffee and a look at wherever the household records are kept." Agatha looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly polite. Then something shifted, not quite approval, not yet, but the beginning of a recalculation. "Records are in the study off the main hall," she said. "Coffee's already on." That was how it started. Rourke came back from the North Range at mid-morning with mud on his boots and a cut on the back of his left hand that he had wrapped in a handkerchief and clearly hadn't thought much about since. He came into the kitchen because that was apparently where he went when he came in from outside. And Maeve was sitting at the kitchen table with 3 years of supply receipts sorted into stacks and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow because she'd forgotten to drink it. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. Neither of them spoke for a moment that was not quite awkward and not quite comfortable. "You're here," he said. "I said I would be." He nodded. Came the rest of the way into the kitchen, poured himself coffee without asking where anything was, which meant he knew his own kitchen, which she noted. He looked at the stacks of receipts. "You didn't waste time." "Time is the one thing we don't have a lot of," Maeve said. "You've got a duplicate billing problem with your feed supplier. I've only been at it 2 hours, and I've already found 3 instances in the past 18 months where you were charged twice for the same delivery." Rourke set his coffee down. He came to stand beside the table and looked at the receipts she had separated. He was close enough that she could see the handkerchief on his hand was starting to soak through. "That's he started. About $42 in overcharges," Maeve said. "That I've found so far. I haven't gotten to the lumber receipts yet." Quiet for a moment. No one caught that. No one was looking for it. She glanced up at him. "Your hand needs something better than that cloth." He looked at the handkerchief like he had genuinely forgotten it was there. "It's fine. It's bleeding through. Barbed wire," he said, not particularly bothered about this fact. "The fence break on the north pasture. One of the posts came down and the wire snapped back." Maeve got up, found the small medical kit in the cabinet, where Agatha had told her it was, and brought it back to the table. She did not ask permission. She sat back down, held out her hand, and waited. Rourke looked at her hand, then at her face, with an expression she couldn't entirely decode, something between surprise and a reluctant kind of acknowledgement. He sat down across from her and unwrapped the handkerchief. The cut was not deep, but it was long, running from his knuckle to the base of his thumb. She cleaned it without ceremony, applied the carbolic, and wrapped it properly. He did not make a sound during any of it, which she suspected was a point of pride rather than evidence that it didn't hurt. "Thank you," he said when she was done. "Don't thank me," she said. "Talk to your feed supplier. I want to be there when you do." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. That was the first real conversation they had. In the weeks that followed, the arrangement settled into something that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. It was more like two people learning the geography of each other, figuring out where the walls were and which ones it was safe to lean against. They were careful with each other in the way of people who have made a practical agreement and are not quite sure yet if it was a mistake. Maeve met the ranch hands one at a time because there were too many of them to absorb all at once. There were 15 men working Blackthorn Basin in winter, more in the summer months. Some of them were young and curious about her in the way young men are curious about things they don't understand. Some of them were older and skeptical in the way older men are skeptical about anything that changes a routine they've gotten used to. A few of them were polite, a couple were actively cold. There was one named Decker Broad, mid-40s, had been at Blackthorn Basin for 12 years, who made no secret of the fact that he wasn't sure about Maeve. He didn't say anything directly. He was too careful for that. But she could see it in the way he talked around her in conversations, the way he deferred to Rourke on things he would have handled himself if she hadn't been in the room. He was not mean, he was just waiting to see. Maeve understood. She had spent her whole life being the person other people waited to see about. She kept working. That was the only currency she had here, and she spent it freely. She finished the supply receipts and moved to the livestock records, and found those were in better shape, clearly understood cattle, understood feed ratios and breeding cycles, and the seasonal math of running a large herd. The financial side was where things fell apart, not from carelessness exactly. More from the accumulated weight of decisions made under pressure, each one defensible in isolation, the consequences invisible until you put them all together and looked at the shape of what they added up to. She didn't share all of what she was finding yet. She was still building the picture. She was also learning the difference between problems that could be fixed quietly and problems that were going to require a harder conversation. There were some of both. 3 weeks in, a family named Briggs showed up at the ranch house on a Tuesday afternoon, a husband and wife in their 50s, their eldest son, and an expression on all three of their faces that Maeve recognized because she had worn it herself. The particular tight around the eyes, look of people who have been carrying something heavy for long enough that they've stopped being able to put it down even in safe company. Chester Briggs had borrowed money from Thaddeus Belrose 2 years ago to get through a drought season. The terms had seemed manageable then. They did not seem manageable now. He had brought paperwork, a battered envelope of it, folded and refolded until the creases were soft, because someone had told him that Rourke Halstead's wife was good with numbers and that she might look at it. Maeve looked at Rourke. Rourke gave her a very slight nod. She sat down with the Briggs family at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. An hour later, she had gone cold and still in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. The loan terms Chester Briggs had signed were not what Chester Briggs had been told they were. The interest structure had a compounding clause buried on the 4th page in language that was technically legal and practically invisible to someone who didn't read contracts for a living. The payments Chester had been making for 2 years had barely touched the principal because of how the interest was being applied. At the current rate, he would owe more in 5 years than he had borrowed in the first place. "Mr. Briggs," Maeve said carefully, "did anyone explain the compounding provision to you when you signed this?" Chester looked at his wife. His wife looked at her hands. "Mr. Belrose's man said it was standard terms," Chester said. "Said everybody signed the same thing." "What man?" Maeve asked. "Name of Garrett. Works out of the bank office." Maeve wrote the name down. "I'm going to need to keep a copy of this," she said. "If that's all right with you." Chester nodded. He looked like someone who had come expecting to be told there was no hope and was not entirely sure what to do with the possibility that there might be. After the Briggs family left, Rourke came and stood at the kitchen doorway again. He did that stood in doorways like he wasn't sure whether he was needed or not. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough," Maeve said. She was still looking at the copy she'd made of the loan document. "And if Chester Briggs has terms like this, I'd want to know how many other families Belrose has put on the same structure." Rourke was quiet. "You already know," Maeve said. It wasn't a question. "I have suspicions," he said. "I couldn't prove anything." "What do you know?" He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table across from her, and for the next 30 minutes he told her things he had apparently been carrying alone for quite a while. Patterns he'd noticed. Families who had gone from struggling to losing land in spans of time that didn't make sense. A foreman on the old Denison spread who had told Rourke privately 2 years ago that the Denisons hadn't missed payments, the bank had simply stopped applying them correctly. "And you never said anything," Maeve said. "To who?" Rourke's voice was flat, not defensive, genuinely asking. "Belrose owns half the town council. The circuit judge that covers Red Willow rode in Belrose's carriage to the last civic dinner. I had suspicions and no paper trail, and the one time I made noise about it quietly, 2 of my supply contracts got suddenly difficult." He looked at her directly. "I'm not telling you this to make excuses. I'm telling you because you're already pulling the same thread, and you need to understand what's wrapped around it." Maeve looked at him for a long moment. "Then we need paper," she said. "Lots of it, and we need to be very quiet about gathering it." Rourke held her gaze. "You understand what you're suggesting?" "I understand exactly what I'm suggesting," Maeve said. "Are you in?" He didn't answer immediately. She was learning that about him. He didn't perform decisiveness. He actually thought before he answered. When he said yes, he meant it. "Yes," he said. Something shifted in the room. Not romantic, this was not that moment. This was 2 people who had entered an arrangement for separate reasons, finding, with some surprise, that they might actually be on the same side. The relationship between them changed in increments so small that Maeve didn't notice most of them until after they had already happened. Breakfast became a thing they shared without having specifically decided to. Rourke was always up before her. She suspected he was up before everyone, but he waited. She didn't know when the waiting started. One morning she came downstairs and he was there with 2 cups poured and the biscuits from yesterday's batch on the table. And it was so unremarkable that it took her until she was halfway through her coffee to realize they had apparently developed a habit. He asked her opinion about things. Not performing inclusion, actually asking, listening to the answer, sometimes pushing back on it, sometimes changing his mind. He disagreed with her twice about cattle decisions in the first month, both times clearly and without apology, and both times he was right. She told him so. He seemed surprised by that, as if the combination of disagreeing and then being told he was right was unfamiliar enough to require processing. "Did your father not take feedback well?" she asked once, when they were riding the west fence line and she had run out of tact. Rourke was quiet for a moment. "My father believed that admitting uncertainty was the same as showing weakness," he said. "He ran the ranch on that principle for 30 years. "And," she asked, "and you've seen the books," Rourke said. Which was all he said about that for a long time. The ranch hands shifted. Decker was the one she tracked, because he was the bellwether, the one the others watched. He came to her in the 5th week with a question about the supply order for spring, the kind of practical question that meant he had decided she was worth consulting. She answered it without making anything of the fact that he was asking. 2 weeks later, he was talking to her like she'd been there for years, not because he'd decided to accept her, but because he'd apparently simply forgotten that he hadn't. She helped a family named Culverson understand a debt structure that a Belrose-connected merchant had built around their grain storage contract. She helped the Briggs family write a formal letter of inquiry to the bank that was specific enough to make ignoring it legally uncomfortable. She organized 2 years of Blackthorn Basin's ledgers into something that could be read at a glance and followed by someone who wasn't already drowning in the details. She also learned the ranch, not just on paper she wrote out. Not with Rourke initially. She borrowed a horse named Solomon, who was steady and patient, and seemed to have decided she was acceptable. And she went out into Blackthorn Basin, the way she had once gone into debt ledgers, methodically, looking for what was true rather than what she'd been told. It was larger than she'd understood, more alive. The winter range had a quality to it in the long afternoons, a particular slant of light on the snow between the ridges that made her throat tighten in a way she didn't have language for. She was not a woman prone to being moved by scenery. But there was something about Blackthorn Basin in winter that got in underneath her practical exterior and sat there. She didn't tell anyone that. The blizzard came in late February. They knew it was coming. The older hands read weather the way other people read books. And there had been 2 days of signs that Maeve didn't understand, but Rourke took seriously enough to spend 48 hours pushing the southern herd to lower pastures and checking every outbuilding's supplies. She rode with him for part of that because she had learned that riding with him was more efficient than getting a report afterward. He didn't explain things twice. On the second day, they were checking the line cabin on the northern ridge. It was the furthest out and had been used by hands working the winter fence line when the storm came in faster than anyone had predicted. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in under an hour. The visibility dropped with it. By the time Rourke said we're staying, the option of leaving had already closed. The line cabin was small. 1 room with a stove, a narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs, a stack of firewood dry enough to burn cleanly. Maeve had been in tighter spaces. She was not frightened. She was, however, acutely aware of the fact that she was about to spend an indeterminate number of hours in a room the size of her aunt's parlor with a man who, after 2 months, she still found largely difficult to read. Rourke got the stove going without ceremony. She unpacked the saddlebags. There were rations enough for a day or two, standard practice apparently, which meant he had planned for this possibility, even if not this specific outcome. She set water to heat. Outside, the wind had gone from loud to something beyond loud, something that was more pressure than sound. How long, she asked. Could be a day, Rourke said. Could be more. The northern storms don't move predictably. He sat down in one of the chairs and looked at the stove in the particular way of someone who is comfortable being still. I'm sorry. She looked at him. For the weather. For putting you in this situation. You didn't cause the blizzard, Mr. Halstead. You could call me Rourke, he said, given. She had not called him anything directly since arriving at the ranch. She had been aware of this. She had not addressed it. Given what? She said. Given that we've been married 2 months and you've never once used my name. She sat down in the other chair. The stove was beginning to throw real heat now. Outside, the storm pressed against the cabin walls with a steadiness that was almost meditative once you stopped fighting it. Rourke, she said, trying it. He nodded once, like something had been settled. They talked that night in a way they had not talked before, which Maeve would later understand was because the cabin gave them nowhere else to be. There was no ledger to return to, no supply order to check, no hand coming to ask a question that needed answering. There was just the stove and the storm, and however many hours remained before the world outside became passable again. Rourke talked about his mother. She had died when he was 11 fever, 3 weeks from sick to gone. He talked about it the way people talk about formative losses, not with drama, but with the careful flatness of someone who learned young that drama didn't help anything. His father had not known how to parent after that. Rourke didn't say his father had been cruel. He said his father had been absent in a way that left the house full of people and still fundamentally empty. He expected me to be ready, Rourke said. From the time I was 12, everything was preparation. You'll run this ranch someday. You'll make the decisions. The weight will be yours. He turned a tin cup in his hands. He died 6 years ago, and sometimes I still wake up thinking I have to go tell him something, and then I remember, and I don't know if it's grief or relief, and I hate that I can't tell the difference. Maeve looked at the fire. It can be both, she said. He looked at her. You speak from experience, my mother, she said. She was not easy to love, but she was the only parent I had, And when she died, I cried for a week, and then I felt something lift that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. And I spent 2 years after that feeling guilty about the lift instead of just grieving the loss." She paused. "Both things can be true. You're allowed to miss someone and also be tired of what they cost you." Rourke was very quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said finally. "That's it exactly." Something passed between them in that moment, not romance, not attraction, though both of those things existed somewhere underneath the conversation, and they both knew it, and neither of them reached for it yet. What passed between them was something plainer, and in some ways more important, recognition. The particular moment of seeing someone clearly and being seen in return. Maeve talked about the years after her mother, the house on Larimer Street that needed a new roof and got patches instead. The accounting work she'd built for herself, not because she'd planned it, but because people discovered she was good at it and started asking. The relentlessness of being the person who held everything together when there was nobody to hold her together in return. "I don't say that asking for sympathy," she said, when she realized she'd been talking for longer than usual. "I'm past the stage where I need sympathy for it." "I didn't take it as asking for sympathy," Rourke said. "I took it as true." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. His profile in the stovelight was serious in the way she'd first read as cold and now understood as simply private, a man who had spent so long keeping his interior landscape to himself that the expression of it required more deliberate effort than it did for most people. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. Why is it so important to you?" She paused. "Not the money, not the obligation. What does it mean to you past all of that?" He thought about it. She had come to value this in him, the thinking, the real kind, before the answer. "There are 41 people whose families rely on what happens here," he said. "Not counting the families like the Briggs, the ones we're connected to even if they don't work the land directly. When everything else my father built turned out to be complicated or broken, or built on something I could respect, that stayed true. 41 families, real people. Their children go to school because of what this land produces." He was quiet. "I can't give that to Belrose. I won't." Maeve said nothing for a moment. "That's not what I expected you to say," she said. "What did you expect?" "Legacy," she said. "Halstead land, Halstead name. That sort of thing." He made a sound that might have been a short laugh. "I have very little attachment to the name," he said. "My father did. I mostly inherited the weight of it." He glanced at her. "What about you? When this year is over, what do you want?" The question landed differently than she expected. Nobody asked her that. People asked her what she needed, sometimes. What she could do, often. Not what she wanted in the larger sense, not the future-shaped question. The one that required her to look past the immediate problem she was currently solving. "I want Ruth to be comfortable," she said, "and I want to not be afraid of the mail." She paused. "And somewhere past that, I want to matter. Not to be grateful for being allowed to be useful. Actually matter." She looked at her hands. "That sounds." "It sounds true," Rourke said. She did not look at him when he said it. She looked at the fire. But something in her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the cold or the wind or any of the practical problems currently arranged in a line in front of her. They slept in shifts, tending the stove, her idea, his agreement. The storm ran its full course through the night and into the following morning. When the wind finally dropped enough to hear individual sounds again, and the light through the single small window shifted from gray to the particular bright white of sun on new snow, they saddled the horses in silence and rode back down toward Blackthorn Basin. They did not speak much on the ride back, but the silence was different now from the silences they'd shared before. Less like two people being careful with each other. More like two people who had set something down in a small storm-bound cabin and weren't quite sure how to pick it back up. Agatha was waiting in the kitchen with coffee and a look on her face that said she had worried and was not going to admit it. Decker was out repairing a secondary fence that had come down in the wind. 3 of the younger hands were clearing the yard. Life resumed its shape. But Maeve sat down that afternoon at the study desk with the ledgers open in front of her and found she could not concentrate in the usual way. Her mind kept going back to the cabin, to what Rourke had said about 41 families and the name he didn't care about. To the way he'd said it sounds true without sentiment, without performance, as if truth were simply the correct response and didn't need ornamentation. She shook herself and looked at the ledger in front of her. And that was when she saw it, not a duplicate charge. Not a misfiled receipt. Something older and worse, a notation in the accounts that didn't match anything in the operating record she'd already cataloged. A reference to a separate set of documents, filed under a different naming convention, stored somewhere she hadn't looked yet. She found them in a box in the back of the storage room that Agatha used as a secondary pantry. 3 years of records kept apart from the main ranch accounts, in Rourke's father's handwriting. She sat on the floor of that storage room with a lamp at her elbow and read them for 2 hours. By the time she was done, her hands were cold and her stomach was worse. She understood now with perfect clarity why Blackthorn Basin was actually in the position it was in. She understood the full shape of the debt, not the surface version she'd been working with, but the real version, the one Rourke had not told her about. She also understood with the same clarity that Rourke had known when he married her. He had known the morning he stood in that cold lawyer's office and watched her sign the papers. He had known everything she had just spent 2 months trying to piece together from fragments. He had not told her. She put the records back in the box carefully. She put the lid on the box. She carried her lamp back through the house and set it on the desk in the study and stood there for a moment looking at nothing in particular. Then she went to find Rourke. She found him in the barn. Not hiding Rourke, Halstead did not hide from things. She had learned that much about him but working, which was apparently what he did when the day had weight to it. He was checking the left foreleg of a roan mare that had been favoring it since the storm, running his hand down the cannon bone with the focused attention of a man who could not afford to lose the animal and also genuinely did not want the animal to be in pain. Both things she had come to understand were true of him simultaneously and always. He looked up when she came in. She was holding the lamp still, even though the barn had its own light. She had not noticed until just now he read her face. She saw him do it, the way his eyes moved across her expression, and something in his own went careful and still. "You found the storage box," he said. It was not a question. Maeve set the lamp down on a feed shelf. She needed both hands free, though she could not have said why. "You knew," she said, "the morning we signed the papers. You already knew the full picture." Rourke straightened up from the mare and turned to face her. He did not look away. "Yes, the river rights clause," Maeve said. "That was real. I'm not questioning that. But the debt, the full scope of it, that's not something you discovered recently. Your father's records go back 8 years. You've had them since he died. 6 years, Rourke. You've known for 6 years how deep it goes." "Yes," he said again. The barn was quiet except for the horses moving in their stalls and the wind, which had softened since the blizzard, but not gone entirely. Maeve looked at him, standing there in the lantern light, not defending himself, not reaching for an explanation before she'd finished laying out what she knew, and felt the particular terrible combination of being furious at someone and also understanding them well enough to see exactly why they had done the thing that made you furious. She hated that. She had always found pure anger easier to sustain when she couldn't see the other side of it. "Tell me," she said. "All of it now," he told her. Blackthorn Basin's debt was not a single catastrophe. It was the accumulated result of a man Rourke's father, Maeve Hollstead, who had spent 30 years running a large operation on the principle that expansion was always the answer. When prices were good, Emmett had borrowed to buy more land. When prices dropped, he had borrowed again to cover the shortfall. When drought came, he had borrowed against future cattle sales to keep the herd alive. Each decision had logic behind it in isolation. Strung together over 3 decades, they had created something that looked like a working ranch and functioned like a slow emergency. Emmett had died, owing money to 4 different creditors, and the arrangement with Belrose, the river rights clause, was not, as Rourke had described in the Silver Heart lobby, simply one ruthless deal made during a drought year. It was the final piece of a larger financial trap that Belrose had been patiently constructing over most of a decade, buying up Emmett's notes from smaller lenders, consolidating the debt, and attaching conditions that were designed to be impossible to meet. The marriage clause was not the most dangerous provision in the documents. It was the most visible one. The most dangerous provision was a secondary clause, buried in language that required a lawyer and considerable patience to decode. If Blackthorn Basin's total debt exceeded a certain threshold, before the river rights were legally secured through the marriage, Belrose had the option to call all notes simultaneously. Not just the river rights, everything. And does it, Maeve asked. Exceed the threshold? Rourke looked at her steadily. Close. How close? Depending on this spring's cattle prices, and whether we can close the eastern grazing lease on the terms I've been negotiating close enough that I've been losing sleep over it for 2 years. Maeve let that sit for a moment. The numbers in her head were running their own calculations without her permission, pulling in everything she'd cataloged over the past 2 months, rearranging it against this new information. You should have told me, she said. Yes, not as accusation. As fact. You should have told me, and you didn't, and I need to understand why before I decide what I think about this. Rourke was quiet for a moment. He leaned against the stall door behind him, not casual, more like a man who needed the support of something solid. When I first proposed the arrangement, he said, I told myself you didn't need to know the full picture. That the river rights were the issue and the rest was my problem to manage. He paused. I also knew that if I told you the full picture, you might not agree. And I needed you to agree. So you made the calculation that your need outweighed my right to know what I was walking into. He didn't flinch. Yes, that's what you said in the lobby, Maeve said. That first night. I asked you why me and you said I seemed trustworthy. What you didn't say was that you also needed someone who wouldn't ask enough questions to find what I just found. Something moved across his face at that. Not guilt exactly, more like the expression of a man watching a true thing land where it belongs and having no argument against it. That's harder to answer, he said. Try. I didn't want someone who would ask too many questions, he said. At the start, that's honest. You're right about that. He paused. But I also meant what I said, about you being decent. About your reputation. Both things were true. Both things can be true, Maeve said, and heard herself saying back to him what she had said in the cabin 3 nights ago, and felt the particular bitterness of a principle being applied in an unfamiliar direction. Rourke heard it too. She could see it. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I handled this well, he said. I handled it the way a desperate man handles things, which is badly, and with too much confidence that I could fix it before it became your problem. He met her eyes directly. I was wrong. I should have told you. I'm telling you now. Because I found it. Because you found it, he said. Yes, I won't pretend the timing is a virtue. Maeve picked up the lamp from the feed shelf. She needed something to do with her hands. I need to think, she said. I know. I'm not leaving, she said, because she could see in his face that he was bracing for it. I said I need to think. Those are different things. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully name relief, mixed with something older and more complicated. The expression of a man who has been waiting for a consequence and gotten something unexpected instead. She went back inside. She sat in the study for 3 hours that night with a pad of paper and a pencil and the full picture of Blackthorn Basin's finances laid out in front of her for the first time. Not the partial picture she'd been working with. Not the version assembled from fragments. The whole thing. It was bad. It was not unsurvivable, which was the more important fact, but it was genuinely bad, and getting there had required years of poor decisions compounding against each other in the particular slow-motion way that large failures operate. You never saw them coming as a single event. They arrived as a long series of individually defensible choices that only looked like a catastrophe when you finally stood far enough back to see the shape of them. She had spent most of her adult life managing smaller versions of exactly this kind of problem for other people. She knew the shape of it. She knew also that the shape had a logic, and that logic could be worked. What she was less sure of was the other thing, the non-numerical thing. The thing that had been building in the line cabin and in the shared breakfasts, and in every moment Rourke had looked at something she'd done and said, yes, that's right, without patting it or performing gratitude. The thing that made his omission hurt in a way that was personal in addition to being practical. She didn't want it to be personal. It complicated everything. She stared at the page in front of her until the numbers stopped swimming and became fixed again. Then she wrote at the top of the page, what can actually be done? And she started working. She was still at the desk when Agatha came in at 6 a.m. with coffee and a look that said she had heard movement in the study all night and had made her own assessments. He told you, Agatha said. It was not a question. Maeve looked up. I found the storage box. Agatha set the coffee down. She stood there for a moment with her hands folded in front of her apron, and Maeve watched her deciding something. I've worked for the Halstead family for 19 years, Agatha said finally. Emmett Halstead was not a bad man. He was a proud man who made prideful decisions and left his son to manage the weight of them. She paused. Rourke has been carrying this alone since his father died. He doesn't ask for help. It's not in him to ask for help. I know, Maeve said. He should have told you, Agatha said. I know that too. Agatha nodded once. Good coffee while it's hot, she said and left. Maeve drank the coffee and kept working. The confrontation she'd had with Rourke in the barn had settled something and unsettled something else in equal measure, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that the unsettled part was not primarily about the finances. She could handle the finances. She had been handling impossible financial situations since she was 17 years old, with a house to run and no one to run it with her. Numbers did not frighten her. Numbers were, in fact, the one place in her life where she had always felt entirely capable. What frightened her was the recognition that she did not want to leave. Not because of the house on Larimer Street, which Rourke's arrangement had made safe. Not because of Ruth's medical expenses, which were being covered. Those were real, but they were not what she was sitting with at 6 a.m. in Rourke Halstead's study, drinking Agatha's coffee and looking at 14 pages of notes she had made in the night. She wanted to stay because somewhere between the supply receipts and the blizzard and the story about his mother, and the way he said it sounds true without any decoration around it, she had made the mistake of caring about the outcome. Not the financial outcome, the other one. She pressed both hands flat on the desk and made herself return to the page in front of her, because the page in front of her was something she could actually work on, and the other thing would have to wait. 2 days later, Maeve rode into town. She told Rourke she was going to check on Ruth, which was true. She did not tell him the other reason, which was that she needed to look at something in the county records office without Rourke present, because she needed to know if what she was beginning to suspect about Thaddeus Belrose was provincial or systemic, and she needed to find that out without whatever weight Rourke's name carried in this town attaching itself to her inquiry. The county records office was run by a man named Howell, who was 60 years old, completely uninterested in anything except the orderly maintenance of his filing system, and deeply pleased when someone came in who actually knew what they were looking for. He pulled records for her without asking questions, which she appreciated, and brought them to a reading table in the back room, where the light was good. She spent 4 hours there. What she found was not surprising exactly. It was the confirmation of a shape she had already begun to trace from the Briggs documents and from what Rourke had told her privately. Belrose had been acquiring water rights and land access through a very specific mechanism, lending money to struggling ranchers during drought or low-price years that appeared manageable, embedding compounding provisions and penalty clauses that were technically visible but practically invisible to anyone, without significant legal literacy, And then, when the math made default inevitable, stepping in to accept land or water access as settlement was not illegal. That was the particular cold elegance of it. Every document was signed. Every provision was technically disclosed. The mechanism worked because of the gap between what was legal and what was honest, and Belrose had been operating in that gap for at least 15 years. She counted 7 families, 7 in the records she could access in an afternoon. She suspected there were more. She also found something she hadn't been looking for. A deed transfer 12 years ago from a family named Alcott. Small operation north of Red Willow, they had borrowed from Belrose during the same drought year that had brought Maeve Hollstead to sign his arrangement. The Alcott debt had defaulted. The deed transfer was to a company called River Basin Holdings. River Basin Holdings, when she traced the registration documents, was owned by a holding entity in the capital city. Maeve sat very still for a moment. Then she went back to the filing cabinet and pulled the registration records for River Basin Holdings' parent company. And then she went back again and pulled the original lending documents for the Alcott debt. They were all signed by the same notary who had witnessed Maeve Hollstead's original arrangement with Belrose. The same notary whose name appeared on 3 other debt instruments she had seen copies of in the past 2 months. Maeve put the records back with the care of a person who understood that care was now a tactical requirement. She thanked Howell. She went to visit Ruth. Ruth was sitting up in bed, which was a better sign than the past few weeks. The visiting nurse Maeve had arranged, funded by the allowance that was part of the marriage arrangement, had made a difference that was measurable in the color of Ruth's face and the steadiness of her breathing. "You look like someone who has found something important and isn't sure whether to be pleased or frightened," Ruth said. "Both," Maeve said. Like always, Ruth reached out and took her hand. "Tell me about him." Maeve looked at her. "I didn't come to talk about him." "I know why you came," Ruth said. "Tell me about him anyway." Maeve was quiet for a moment. She looked out Ruth's window at the winter street below. The ordinary midday traffic of a small Montana town going about its business, without knowing that the most financially powerful man in it had been systematically dismantling his neighbors for 15 years. "He should have told me," Maeve said, "about how bad the debt actually was." "Did he admit that?" "Without being pushed into it." "Yes, Ruth said. "That's not absolution," Maeve said. "I'm not offering absolution," Ruth said. "I'm gathering information." She paused. "Does he know what you're doing?" "The investigating." "He knows the general direction," Maeve said. "Not the specifics." "Why not the specifics?" Maeve thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because if I tell him before I understand the full shape of it, he'll want to act. And he'll act in a way that's visible, because that's how he operates. He meets things directly. And right now, I don't want Belrose to know anyone is looking." Ruth was quiet for a moment, watching her niece's face. "You're protecting him," she said. "Not accusatory. Just observing. I'm protecting the strategy," Maeve said. Ruth said, with the tone of a woman who had known Maeve for 28 years and was not going to press the point, but was also not going to pretend she didn't see it. Maeve went back to Blackthorn Basin that afternoon with more information than she had left with, and a set of concerns she was assembling into something she could use. March arrived with a particular cruelty warm enough to be misleading for 2 or 3 days, then turning back to cold with a vindictiveness that felt personal. The cattle that had been pushed south during the blizzard needed to be moved again as conditions shifted. Rourke was out for 3 days straight, sleeping rough at the southern camp and coming back to the main house only to change horses and exchange information with Decker. Maeve managed the household in his absence without being asked to, because someone needed to, and she was there and capable. She handled 2 delivery disputes, organized the spring supply orders based on the renegotiated terms she had established with 3 different merchants over the previous weeks, and wrote 4 letters on behalf of neighboring families that were polite, specific, and designed to make it uncomfortable for Belrose-connected creditors to ignore them. She also kept pulling on the thread she'd found in the county records. She wrote a letter to a lawyer in the capital city, not signed with her own name, signed as a correspondent making general inquiries about holding company registration records, which was a thing that was public and available to anyone who asked, and received back a detailed response that confirmed what she had suspected. River Basin Holdings was the third in a chain of holding structures. At the top of the chain was a company whose registered agent was a man named Cornelius Garrett. Garrett, the same name the Briggs family had given her. The man from the bank office who had told Chester Briggs that the compounding terms were standard. She sat with that for a full day, turning it over, looking for the angle she was missing. Found it at night, reading through Emmett Halstead's correspondence files boxes of it, imperfectly organized. The accumulated letters of a man who had kept everything and filed nothing. She was looking for anything related to the original Belrose arrangement. What she found instead was a letter, 8 years old, written to Emmett Halstead from a rancher named Voss who had operated east of Red Willow. Voss had written to warn Emmett. The letter was careful in its language, but explicit in its meaning. Belrose was not a simple banker extending credit. The credit was a mechanism. The mechanism had a designed outcome, and that outcome was always the same. Voss had seen it happen to 2 families he knew personally and was watching it begin with 2 more. Emmett had apparently not acted on the letter, or if he had, there was no record of it. But the letter existed, in Emmett's own files, which meant Emmett had known or had been told, and the arrangement with Belrose had proceeded anyway. Maeve put the letter aside very carefully. She was still sitting with it when she heard the front door and Rourke's boots on the hallway floor, the particular uneven rhythm of a man who had been in the saddle for 16 hours and was carrying the weight of it in every joint. Came to the study doorway. He looked at her face. He looked at the letter on the desk. "What is that?" he said. She looked up at him. He was trail-dirty and tired in the specific boneless way of physical exhaustion. And there was something in his eyes she recognized as the look of a man who has been out on the land doing hard work and is only now returning to the harder work that lives inside the walls. "Sit down," she said, "Maeve Rourke. Sit down." He came into the study. He sat in the chair across from her, the same chair where he had sat 2 months ago when she had bandaged his hand and told him to talk to the feed supplier. He looked at the letter. "How much do you know about a man named Cornelius Garrett?" she asked. His expression shifted. "Belrose's man runs the loan processing at the bank." "Why?" "Because Garrett is also the registered agent for a holding company called River Basin Holdings, which holds the deed to the Alcott property north of town, and is the third layer of a corporate structure that exists specifically to distance the acquisition of foreclosed ranch land from Belrose's direct name." She watched him process this. "And because the Briggs family knows Garrett's name as the man who explained their loan terms to them. And because a man named Voss wrote your father a letter 8 years ago warning him that Belrose was running a systematic scheme to acquire water access from indebted ranchers, and your father kept the letter and apparently did nothing with it." The silence in the study was very full. Rourke picked up the Voss letter. He read it. His face went through several things while he was reading it. When he set it down, his expression had settled into something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, something that lived between those two things in the particular place where a person processes discovering that a parent had known something important and made the choice to look away from it. "He knew," Rourke said. "The letter suggests he was warned at least," Maeve said carefully. "What he understood from it and what he did with it, I can't say for certain." "He kept it," Rourke said. "He kept it, which means he understood enough to think it mattered. And then he did nothing. He set the letter down on the desk and looked at his hands for a moment. He was proud. Too proud to admit he'd already walked too far into the arrangement to get out without losing face. He paused. He walked further in instead. Maeve did not say anything. She was aware that this was not a moment for practical information. Rourke was quiet for a long time. The lamp between them burned steadily. Outside, the March wind moved against the house in the same low, persistent way it had been moving all month. "I owe you another apology," he said finally. His voice was even, but it cost him something. "For your father's choices? For mine." He looked up at her. "I should have told you what I knew. About the debt, yes. But also about my suspicions regarding Belrose. You've spent 2 months piecing together information I could have given you in the first week. I held it back because I didn't fully trust you yet, and because I was." He stopped. "I was ashamed of the position the ranch was in. It's easier to hand someone a contained problem than to show them the full mess." Maeve looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "I've done the same thing. I didn't tell the Corwin family everything I knew about their debt situation last fall because I thought knowing the full picture would paralyze them, and I could fix most of it myself." She paused. "I was wrong. They should have known." Rourke held her gaze. "You're being generous. I'm being accurate," she said. "Which is different." She looked down at the pages in front of her. "The question now is what we do with what we have. Because we have more than I realized when I started looking, and it's more than just Blackthorn Basin. You said 7 families in the county records, at minimum. Probably more." She looked at him directly. "Belrose is going to move before spring. The River Rights Clause has a deadline, and whatever legal challenge he's preparing will come before that deadline. I think he already knows the marriage is real enough to survive simple scrutiny. So I think he's going to attack on a different front." "The debt threshold," Rourke said. He had arrived at the same place. "If he can establish that we've crossed it before the river rights are secured." "Then the marriage condition is irrelevant," Maeve said. "He can call all the notes at once, and it doesn't matter whether we're married or not." Rourke was very still. "How close are we to the threshold?" "Closer than you told me," Maeve said quietly. "The Eastern Grazing lease, the terms you've been negotiating." "Where are they?" His jaw tightened. The other party pulled back last week. "I was going to tell you when I had an alternative to offer." Maeve pressed her palms flat on the desk. She took one breath. "We have to stop doing that," she said, "both of us. Holding information until we have a solution to offer with it. We can't afford that anymore. Whatever you know, I need to know. Whatever I find, you need to know. We work this together or we don't work it at all." He looked at her across the desk in the lamplight with an expression that was stripped of the careful, private quality it usually carried. No guard, no management, just a man at the end of a very long road looking at someone and deciding. "Together," he said. She nodded. "There's something else," he said, and the shift in his voice told her before his words did that they had arrived at something she hadn't found yet. "Tell me," she said. "Belrose has been talking to the circuit judge," Rourke said. "Not about the river rights, about the marriage itself. He's been suggesting, privately, to enough people that it will have become general knowledge by now that the marriage is fraudulent. That it was arranged specifically to circumvent the terms of the agreement and that it should therefore be invalidated." Maeve went completely still. "He's calling for a town hearing," Rourke said. "I received word this morning while I was on the range. He's filed a formal challenge. 2 weeks, 2 weeks. Maeve looked at the pages in front of her, at the Voss letter. At the 7 families' worth of evidence she had begun to accumulate and had not yet organized into anything that could be used in a public forum. At the names and numbers and records she had been quietly gathering for weeks without knowing precisely what shape they would need to take. She understood now. She also understood something about herself that she had been trying not to look at directly since the blizzard, since the barn. Since every shared breakfast and quiet evening and moment of being seen by this man in a way she had not been seen before. She was not going to leave, not because the contract required her to stay. Not because the house on Larimer Street was tied to the outcome. Not because Ruth's medical expenses were on the line, though they were. She was going to fight Thaddeus Belrose in a public hearing in 2 weeks because 41 families depended on what happened to Blackthorn Basin, and because 7 other families had been systematically robbed by a man who counted on no one ever assembling the full picture And because she had spent her entire life being told she had come through the wrong door, and she was finished accepting that as a verdict. And because the man sitting across from her had said together and meant it, and that was worth something she didn't have a word for yet. 2 weeks is enough, she said. Rourke looked at her. It's not enough to build a perfect case, she said. It's enough to build a true one. She picked up her pencil. Tell me everything Belrose's messenger said this morning. Word for word, if you can. Rourke straightened in the chair, still exhausted from 3 days on the range. He was also, she could see, the kind of man who finds a second wind when someone gives him a clear direction to run in. He started talking. She started writing. Outside, the March wind pushed against the house without getting in, and in the study lamp the shadows held steady. And what had begun 6 weeks ago as two people with a practical agreement and separate motives had become, without either of them making a formal declaration about it, something else entirely, two people who had chosen the same fight for reasons that had long since stopped being only about survival. The 2 weeks before the hearing were the most productive and most exhausting of Maeve's life, and that was a significant statement given that her life had contained a fair number of both. They worked in the study most evenings until well past midnight, Rourke on one side of the desk and Maeve on the other, the lamp burning between them and papers arranged in the particular organized chaos that Maeve had developed over years of working through complicated financial situations grouped by family, then by creditor, then by the specific mechanism Belrose had used, because the mechanism mattered. The mechanism was the story. The individual cases were evidence, but the mechanism was what would make people understand that what had happened to the Briggs family and the Alcott family and the 5 others was not bad luck or poor judgment. It was architecture. Someone had built this. Rourke was, she discovered, a better research partner than she had expected. He did not have her facility with the financial documents, but he understood the land and the people and the history in ways that filled in gaps she didn't know she had. He knew which families had borrowed when and under what circumstances. He knew which seasons had been the pressure points, the droughts, the price drops, the disease years that had pushed ranchers toward whatever credit was available. He knew, in the way that someone who had grown up in a community knows without ever formally learning it, the human geography of the valley and how Belrose had moved through it. The Denison spread, Rourke said one night, around 11, when they had been at it for 4 hours. I told you about the foreman who said the payments weren't being applied correctly. His name is Walt Purdy. He's in Red Willow now. The Denisons lost the land 3 years ago, and Purdy took work at the grain mill. Can he document it? Maeve asked. He kept his own records, Rourke said. The Denisons trusted him with the books, the same way you handle accounts for families in town. He might have copies of the payment records. Maeve looked up from what she was writing. You've known this for 3 years. I didn't have a way to use it, he said. One foreman's word against Belrose's bank documentation, that's not evidence, that's a grievance. It goes nowhere, it goes somewhere now, Maeve said. If it matches the pattern I can demonstrate with the other families. She put Purdy's name at the top of a separate page. I need to talk to him before the hearing. I'll take you, Rourke said. I should go alone, she said. Your name in a room where someone is deciding whether to trust you with information about Belrose, that's a complication. People in this town have complicated feelings about the Halstead name. He did not argue with this, which she appreciated. It was accurate, and he knew it. She went the next afternoon. Walt Purdy was a compact, deliberate man of 55 who received her in the break room of the grain mill, with the wary politeness of someone who had learned to be careful about what he said and to whom. He made her tea she didn't particularly want and sat across from her and waited to see what she was actually there for. She told him plainly. No preamble, no warmth she hadn't earned yet, just the shape of what she was building and where his records might fit into it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The Denisons were good people, he said. They worked that land for 22 years. Raised 4 children on it. When they lost it, Mr. Denison got sick within a year. His wife says it was the grief of the land going. He looked at his hands. I kept those records because I knew something wasn't right, and I thought someday somebody would want to know. I just didn't figure it would take 3 years for somebody to come asking. He went home that evening and came back the following morning with a packet of payment records that were so precisely kept, so methodically organized, that Maeve spent the first 5 minutes simply looking at them with the appreciation of someone who recognized genuine care in record keeping. You did this yourself, she said. Every month, Purdy said. The date, the amount, the bank representative who accepted the payment, the receipt number. He paused. There are 14 months where the payments are documented on my side and missing from the bank's accounting of the debt. I know because I saw the statement they sent the Denisons 6 months before the foreclosure. The math didn't match. I told Mr. Denison, and he wrote to the bank, and they sent back a letter saying the statement was correct. 14 months of payments that had simply vanished into Cornelius Garrett's accounting system and never been applied to the principal. Maeve made copies of everything, worked at Purdy's kitchen table that evening while he sat in the next room, and his wife brought coffee without being asked. She wrote for 2 hours. Her hand cramped, and she shook it out and kept writing. When she left, Purdy walked her to her horse. Mrs. Halstead, he said, then stopped himself. Is that right? That's what I've heard people call you. It's right, she said. She still had occasional moments of surprise when she heard it applied to herself, but this was not one of them. You think this is going to work? He asked. Not hopeful, not cynical, just asking. I think the truth is easier to demonstrate than the lie was to construct, Maeve said. Belrose has been careful, but careful and honest are different things, and careful only works until someone lines up all the pieces in the same room. Purdy nodded slowly. The Denisons are in Great Falls now. If you needed them to say something, I might, she said. I'll send word if it comes to that. She rode back to Blackthorn Basin in the late afternoon with the copies in her saddlebag and the particular feeling that comes when a picture you've been assembling in the dark suddenly gets enough light on it that you can see what it actually is. The hearing was in 9 days. 3 days before it, Belrose made his first move. He did not do it directly. He never did anything directly. The move came through a merchant named Sable, who supplied Blackthorn Basin with dry goods and had been doing so for 11 years. Sable arrived at the ranch unannounced on a Thursday morning and asked to speak with Rourke, and his manner was apologetic in the specific way of a man who has been told to deliver a message he doesn't personally agree with. Maeve was in the kitchen when he arrived. She stayed. Sable told Rourke that his line of credit with the supply house was being suspended pending the outcome of the hearing. The suspension had been, Sable said carefully, suggested rather than mandated. But the suggestion had come from the bank, and the supply house's own credit depended on the bank, and he was sorry, but he didn't see a way around it. Rourke listened to this with a completely level expression. I understand, he said. Thank you for coming to tell me in person. After Sable left, Rourke stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, with the particular stillness of a man exercising significant self-control. He's pressuring the supply chain, Maeve said. Yes. To demonstrate that he can create consequences before the hearing even starts, she said. So people know that testifying on our side has a cost. Yes. Rourke turned and looked at her. 2 more suppliers got similar suggestions yesterday. Clem heard it from the feed yard. Maeve thought about this. Who's the most independent supplier you deal with? Someone whose business doesn't depend on Belrose's banking connections. Rourke thought. Harker's lumberyard, maybe. Harker has his own financing through a company in Billings. He's never been comfortable with Belrose. I want to talk to Harker, Maeve said. And I want to talk to the Briggs family again. And I want to know whether the families we've been documenting understand that they have an opportunity in 2 days to say in a public forum what has been happening to them. Rourke looked at her carefully. You're asking them to stand up in front of the whole town and accuse the man who holds their debt. I'm asking them to tell the truth in a public forum that will have legal standing, Maeve said. which is different from accusation. She paused. But yes, I know what I'm asking. I'm going to ask it anyway, because if nobody says it out loud, nothing changes. Something moved through Rourke's expression. You know, he said, when I walked across that ballroom in January and took your hand, I told myself I was making a calculated choice. I told myself I had assessed you correctly, and this was a strategic decision. Maeve waited. I assessed you correctly, he said. But I was wrong about what I was assessing. He looked at her with an expression she recognized now, the stripped-down, unguarded version of him that had emerged fully only in the blizzard cabin and came out more easily now. I thought I was measuring your trustworthiness and your discretion. I didn't understand I was looking at your spine. Maeve felt something warm move through her chest. She didn't let it show on her face because there were 9 days until the hearing, and sentiment was not helpful right now. Then it's good that you took my hand, she said, and turned back to the papers on the table. She heard him make a sound behind her, not quite a laugh. The closest thing to it she had heard from him. She went to see the Briggs family that afternoon. Chester opened the door and stood back to let her in, without her having to explain why she was there, which meant the hearing had reached them already. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and the midday meal and the particular density of a house where people had been talking about hard things. Chester's wife, Ida, was at the table. Their son, Marcus, who was 23 and had his mother's eyes in his father's jaw, was standing against the wall with his arms crossed. All three of them looked at Maeve when she sat down with the particular look of people at a crossroads. You know about the hearing, Maeve said. We know, Chester said. We also know that Belrose sent a man around this morning to remind us that our note comes up for renewal in June. He said it flatly. Not complaining, just telling her the shape of the ground. I know, Maeve said. I want to tell you what I have and what I think it amounts to, and then I want you to make your own decision. I'm not going to tell you what to do, she told them. All of it the Dennison records, the holding company structure, the pattern she had documented across 7 families, the Voss letter, the mechanism. She laid it out the way she laid out finances, in order, with evidence, without editorial. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Marcus uncrossed his arms. 14 months of payments that disappeared, he said. Documented by an independent bookkeeper who maintained his own records over the full period of the Dennison loan, Maeve said. If your payment records show the same pattern, we can demonstrate that this is not an error. Errors don't repeat themselves identically across multiple accounts. Chester looked at Ida. Ida looked at her hands for a moment, then looked up at Maeve. If we stand up at that hearing, Ida said, and Belrose wins anyway, what happens to us? It was the right question, and it deserved a straight answer. Your note comes up in June regardless, Maeve said. If Belrose wins the hearing, he will have demonstrated that his methods survive public scrutiny, and your note renewal will go however he decides it goes. She paused. If we win, the agreements underlying his claim against Blackthorn Basin get invalidated, and what I'm building is a record of his practices that is detailed enough to survive legal review. That doesn't automatically fix your situation, but it gives you something to stand on that you don't currently have. And if nobody stands up but us, Chester said, then it's less likely to work, Maeve said honestly. I won't tell you otherwise. Chester Briggs looked at his son. Marcus gave him a single nod, the compact nod of a young man who has already made his decision and is waiting for his father to arrive at the same place. Chester looked back at Maeve. We'll be there, he said. Maeve rode to 2 more families that afternoon and 1 the following morning. The pattern of the conversations was the same each time. Careful listening. The specific fear of people who had already been hurt once by trusting the wrong process. The question of what happened if they stepped forward and it didn't work. She gave the same straight answers every time. She did not promise outcomes she could not guarantee. She told them what she had and what she thought it was worth and let them decide. 4 of the 7 families committed. The 5th had already left the county. The 6th told her no quietly with an apology that she accepted without making them feel worse about it. The seventh was the Denisons, who were in Great Falls, and she sent the letter to them on the second day and did not hear back before the hearing. 2 days before the hearing, Agatha came to the study in the evening with something in her hand that she had apparently been deciding about for several hours. Maeve was alone. Rourke was out making a final check of the north fence because work did not stop because a crisis was building. Agatha stood in the doorway for a moment, which was unusual for a woman who generally went directly to the point. Then she came to the desk and put down a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine. "These are from the archive room," she said. "The correspondence files I manage, not the ones in the main storage." She paused. "I've been at Blackthorn Basin for 19 years. I've kept letters that were sent here, and letters that were drafted here, and letters that arrived and got set aside. These are in the second category." She put her finger on the bundle. 7 letters, over 12 years, addressed to Thaddeus Belrose from Maeve Hollstead, requesting renegotiation of the terms of the river rights arrangement, and 7 responses. All 7 responses denied the request. The language in the denials changes across the years. In the last 2, the languages she stopped, chose her word. Specific, about the consequences of not meeting the full terms. Maeve looked at the letters. She looked at Agatha. "You've had these, I've had copies," Agatha said. Emmett made a practice of keeping copies of significant correspondence. "He gave me the filing responsibility the last year of his life." A pause. "When Rourke took over, I continued the practice. These have been in my files since Emmett died." "Why are you bringing them now?" Maeve said. Agatha looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for the right person to appear before she was willing to hand something over. "Because Rourke has been fighting this alone for 6 years, she said. "And because you're the first person I've seen who is fighting it smart." Maeve untied the bundle. The letters were what Agatha had said they were. What Agatha had not fully described was the tone of Belrose's final 2 responses, which had moved from formal denial to something that read very clearly, to Maeve's eye, as threat. Not a legal threat, careful threat, the kind that operates entirely within the language of business correspondence while communicating something else entirely to anyone who understood what they were reading. Maeve sat with them for a long time. When Rourke came back at 9 that night, she was still at the desk. She showed him the letters. She watched him read them. She watched something move through his face that was not surprise he knew Belrose's capabilities, but was something harder to absorb, which was seeing his father's handwriting on 7 years of requests that went nowhere. 7 years of a man trying to find a way out of something that had been designed not to have one. "He tried," Rourke said. His voice was quiet. "He tried," Maeve agreed. Rourke set the letters down carefully. "Does this help us?" The final 2 responses established that Belrose understood the specific consequence of noncompliance and communicated it in writing, Maeve said. "That matters because his argument at the hearing is going to be that the marriage condition is the binding term and that your marriage is fraudulent. But if I can show that the marriage condition was one piece of a larger structure of coercive terms that he himself constructed and enforced through written correspondence over 12 years, it changes the question the hearing needs to answer." She paused. "He wants the hearing to be about your marriage. I need it to be about his business practices. These letters help move it there." Rourke looked at her across the desk. "You've turned this into something different from what he planned." "I'm trying to," she said. "He planned for you to defend yourself. He didn't plan for someone to have been quietly collecting his methods for 2 months." Rourke was quiet for a moment. Maeve, she looked up. "Whatever happens at that hearing," he said, "whatever the outcome is, I need you to know that what I said in the barn about choosing you because you were trustworthy, that was true when I said it. And it's not what it was now. What it is now is something I don't have a clean word for, but it's not what I came to you with in January." He stopped. He was not a man who found this kind of articulation easy, and the effort of it was visible. "I wanted to say that before the hearing, before it gets complicated by whatever happens in that room. So you know it wasn't said because of the outcome. Maeve looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. That's all, he said. For now, she said, after the hearing. She held his gaze. There will be an after the hearing. I intend to make sure of it. He nodded, slowly, like something had been placed in a safe location. The morning of the hearing, Red Willow filled up in a way it hadn't since the last election. Maeve was aware of it as they drove in from the ranch, the extra horses at the hitching posts, the groups of men standing outside the town hall with the particular body language of people who are there, because something is happening and they don't want to miss it. The town hall was a large room that smelled like pine and old wool and the smoke of however many meetings it had hosted over its existence. The benches filled from the front. Maeve recognized faces from the families she had visited, the accounts she had kept, the pies she had delivered to the Silverheart Hotel on a January evening that felt like a different lifetime. Chester Briggs was there with Ida and Marcus. The Harker family sat 2 rows behind them. Walt Purdy was near the back, upright, with his hands folded on the document packet in his lap. 3 other families she had spoken with were arranged through the room in 1s and 2s. Belrose was already at the front table when they arrived, with a lawyer from the Capitol and 2 men Maeve recognized as his senior bank officers. He was dressed with the particular care of a man who wants to project authority without appearing to be trying. He looked across the room when Maeve and Rourke came in, and his expression was pleasantly neutral in the way that very confident people are pleasant because they don't see the need to be anything else. He looked at Maeve for perhaps 2 seconds, then he looked away. She noted that. The circuit magistrate, a man named Aldrin, who had traveled from the county seat for the occasion, called the room to order with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had a schedule and intended to keep it. He explained the nature of the preceding Belrose's formal challenge to the validity of the Halstead marriage and the associated claim on the river rights under the terms of the original agreement, and invited Belrose's counsel to present first. Belrose's lawyer was efficient and unpleasant in the way of lawyers who are very good at what they do and are not particularly interested in performing warmth about it. He established the original agreement. He established the marriage clause. He established the timeline. And then he made his argument, which was precise. The marriage between Rourke Halstead and Maeve Hollowell had been contracted specifically to circumvent the terms of the original agreement, was therefore fraudulent in intent, and should be invalidated. He produced a signed statement from 2 witnesses who claimed to have been at the Silverheart Hotel banquet in January, and who stated that Rourke Halstead had publicly claimed to be married to a woman he had apparently met for the first time that evening. The room buzzed. Magistrate Aldrin called for quiet. Rourke's lawyer, a good man from Billings, who had been briefed thoroughly, but who had not been told everything, because Maeve had her own sequencing in mind, responded by confirming that yes, the marriage had been contracted in January. He did not attempt to argue that the ballroom announcement had been false. He offered the valid marriage certificate. He offered testimony from the lawyer who had witnessed the signing. He offered the straightforward record of a legal marriage. Belrose's counsel argued that legal form without honest intention was not binding. The magistrate asked Rourke directly whether the marriage had been contracted as a business arrangement. Rourke stood. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when the person at the center of a dispute chooses to speak. Yes, Rourke said. His voice carried without effort. It began as an arrangement. I was facing a deadline I couldn't meet by honest means, and I made a desperate choice that was unfair to my wife. He paused. I'm not going to stand here and argue that the beginning was something it wasn't. I could try to dress it up. I'm not going to. The murmur that moved through the room was not entirely sympathetic, but it was not hostile either. It was the sound of people recognizing honesty when they heard it, which was sufficiently rare in a legal proceeding that it required processing. Belrose's lawyer looked briefly pleased, which was a mistake he would recognize later. Rourke sat down. Magistrate Aldrin asked if Belrose wished to proceed on the basis of the admission. Belrose's lawyer said yes, and began to build his conclusion. And then Maeve stood up. She had not told Rourke's lawyer she was going to do this. She had told Rourke the night before, and he had looked at her for a long moment and said, "All right," which was the entirety of what she needed from him. "Magistrate Aldrin," she said, "if the question before this proceeding is whether my marriage is genuine, I'd like to address it." Aldrin looked at her, then he looked at both lawyers. Then he said, "Proceed, Mrs. Halstead." Belrose's lawyer began to object, and Aldrin stopped him with a look. Stood in front of that room with 60 people watching her, many of the same 60 people who had been in the Silver Heart Hotel ballroom, and she did not look at Belrose, and she did not look at Rourke. She looked at the magistrate, because the magistrate was the one who mattered. "My husband told you the truth," she said. "The marriage began as a contract. What he didn't tell you, because it is not in his nature to defend himself by explaining himself, is that my decision to remain at Blackthorn Basin was made freely, and was made again every day since January, and was never about the original terms." She paused. "I stayed because the work mattered, and because the people depending on that ranch deserved someone paying attention to their situation. I stayed because my husband is, whatever the origin of our arrangement, a man of more integrity than this proceeding is designed to give him credit for." She let that sit for one beat. "And I stayed because I chose to, not because a contract required it. Because I chose it." The room was very quiet. Then Maeve did the thing she had planned. "However," she said, and her voice was steady and clear and carried to every corner of the room, "I'd like to suggest that the question of my marriage, while apparently very interesting to Mr. Belrose, is not the most important question in this room today." Belrose shifted at the front table. The original agreement between Thaddeus Belrose and the late Emmett Halstead was one of at least 8 similar agreements that Mr. Belrose has entered into with landowners in this valley over the past 15 years, Maeve said. In each case, the structure was the same. Credit extended during a period of financial pressure at terms that included compounding provisions and penalty clauses that were technically disclosed and practically invisible, designed to ensure that default was mathematically inevitable regardless of the borrower's payment behavior. Belrose's lawyer was on his feet. "Magistrate, this is entirely—" "I have documentation," Maeve said, over him, her voice not rising. 14 months of payment records from the Dennison property, maintained by their independent bookkeeper, demonstrating that properly made payments were not applied to the principal balance. I have loan documents from 5 families in this room showing identical compounding structures. I have corporate registration records demonstrating that the land and water rights acquired through these defaults flow to a holding company registered to a man named Cornelius Garrett, who is simultaneously a loan officer at Mr. Belrose's bank." She paused. "And I have 12 years of correspondence between Mr. Belrose and Emmett Halstead, including 2 letters in which Mr. Belrose explicitly describes the consequences of failing to meet the full terms of the agreement in language that suggests a full and deliberate awareness of the trap he was maintaining." The room was not quiet anymore. Belrose was speaking to his lawyer in a low, rapid voice. The magistrate called for order twice. Maeve waited. When the room settled, she continued, "I am not a lawyer," she said. "I am a woman who keeps accounts. What I am presenting is not a legal argument. It is a record. A carefully documented, cross-referenced record of a practice that has been costing families in this valley their land and their livelihoods for 15 years, conducted by the same man who is standing before this proceeding today, asking for the river rights to Blackthorn Basin." She looked at Magistrate Aldrin directly. "I would respectfully suggest that what this hearing should be investigating is not whether my husband and I are genuinely married. It is whether the agreement underlying Mr. Belrose's claim is itself legitimate." Aldrin looked at the documents she had placed on the table before her. He looked at Belrose. He looked at the room. Chester Briggs stood up. He didn't wait to be called. He stood up and said, in the flat voice of a man who has been carrying something for too long, everything she said about the compounding terms I signed that paper. I made every payment, and I owe more now than the day I signed. Walt Purdy stood up from the back. The Dennison records she's describing, those are my records. I kept them. I'll swear to them under any standard this court requires. A woman Maeve recognized as the widow Carver, whose husband had lost the South pasture land 3 years ago and died shortly after, stood up without saying anything at all. Just stood and sat back down. Then Marcus Briggs stood up. He was 23 years old, and he stood the way young men stand when they have decided something and are not going back from it. And he said, "My family has lived on that land since before I was born. We didn't lose it because we didn't work. We lost it because someone built us a hole and told us it was a door." Maeve stood in the front of that room and felt something she didn't have a name for move through her like weather. The hearing did not end that day. Legal proceedings are not movies they do not resolve in single sessions. Magistrate Aldrin called a recess and requested that all documentation be formally submitted. He requested that Belrose's counsel respond to the specific allegations regarding the holding company and the payment records. He set a continuation date, and he made a procedural note that elevated the proceeding from a simple challenge hearing to something with a broader investigative scope. But something had happened in that room that was not procedural. Belrose, leaving through the side door with his lawyer, passed close to where Maeve was standing, gathering her papers. He stopped. He looked at her with an expression that was working very hard to remain neutral and was not entirely succeeding. "You are a very thorough woman, Mrs. Halstead," he said. "I've had to be," Maeve said, without looking up from her papers. He left. Rourke appeared at her side a moment later. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood there, which was what he did when something required processing. "You didn't tell me about the Carver woman," he said finally. "I didn't know she was going to stand up," Maeve said. "I didn't ask her to be here." Rourke looked across the room at the widow Carver, who was being spoken to by 3 other women with the gentle, focused attention of people who have been waiting to acknowledge something for a long time. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose you did." He put his hand on her back. Just briefly, the pressure of a palm between her shoulder blades for a moment, warm and solid, and not performed for any audience because the audience had largely dispersed. Just there, just that, she didn't move away from it. Agatha was waiting at the ranch house when they returned in the late afternoon. She had dinner on and a look on her face that was as close to anxious as Maeve had ever seen from her. "Well," Agatha said. "It's not finished," Maeve said. But it moved in the right direction. Agatha let out a long, slow breath. Then she went back to the stove. Decker was in the kitchen, too, which was unusual. He looked at Maeve when she came in. Then he looked at Rourke. Then he said, in the manner of a man who has decided something and is choosing his words, "Accordingly, I heard what happened in town. Few of the hands heard too." He paused. "We wanted you to know we're not going anywhere. Whatever shakes out from this," he said you, but he was looking at Maeve when he said it. She had to look away for a moment. She found she was very tired, suddenly the bone-deep tired that arrives after adrenaline leaves, the kind that makes even a lit kitchen feel very far away. "Thank you, Decker," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. He nodded, went back outside. The other hands followed. Rourke sat down at the kitchen table. Maeve sat across from him. Between them, the lamp burned in the same position it always had, and the ranch outside was doing what it always did. And none of that had changed. But the shape of what they were to each other had moved again, incremented forward by another degree in the direction it had been moving since January. "How long until the continuation hearing?" Rourke asked. 3 weeks, Maeve said. "Aldrin needs time to review the documentation formally and allow Belrose's counsel to respond." She paused. 3 weeks gives us time to make the record stronger. I want to contact the Dennisons in Great Falls, and I want to find out whether any of the other holding company acquisitions have title irregularities." Looked at her. "You're not stopping. We can't stop," she said. "Winning today's session means Aldrin is asking the right questions. It doesn't mean Belrose can't find a way to answer them." She looked at the lamp. He has more resources than we do, and he's had longer to build his position. The record I have is good. It needs to be better. What do you need from me? Rourke said. Same as always, she said. Tell me what you know, all of it, when you know it. He held her gaze. Yes, he said, all of it. They sat in the kitchen together while the evening settled into night outside and the lamp burned lower, and Agatha moved quietly around the edges of the room, and the world that existed past the ranch's fences went about its business without them. Maeve picked up her pencil. There was more work to do. The 3 weeks between the first hearing and the continuation felt like two different kinds of time running simultaneously, the kind that moved too fast when Maeve was working, and the kind that moved like cold syrup in the hours before sleep when her mind ran through every gap in her documentation and every possible counter-argument Belrose's lawyer might construct. She had learned, over the years, that anxiety and preparation feel identical at 3 in the morning. The only way to tell them apart is whether you're still holding a pencil. Most nights she was still holding a pencil. The letter from the Dennisons arrived on the 8th day. It was written in the careful, slightly formal hand of a woman, Eleanor Dennison, Chester had told her, was the one who handled correspondence, and it was 2 pages long. And by the second paragraph, Maeve's throat had tightened in a way she didn't try to prevent. Eleanor Dennison wrote that she and her husband had been living in Great Falls for 3 years, that her husband Franklin's health had not recovered from the loss of the ranch, that he had good days and bad days, that the bad days were connected in ways she couldn't prove but absolutely knew to the fact of what had happened to them. She wrote that she had kept every document, every payment receipt, every letter to and from the bank, because she had known something was wrong and had not known what to do with the knowing. She wrote that if there was a proceeding where her records would matter, she would find a way to bring them. She wrote one other thing, at the bottom of the second page, almost as an afterthought. I want my husband to see that someone finally asked. Maeve read that line 3 times. She wrote back that same day. She told Eleanor Dennison exactly what was happening, what the documentation she held would contribute, and what the realistic range of outcomes looked like. She did not promise more than she could deliver. She told Eleanor that the continuation hearing was in 11 days, and that if she and Franklin could make the journey, their presence would matter, not just their records, but their presence. That there was a difference between a document and a person, and that sometimes a room needed to see what a document could only describe. Eleanor wrote back in 4 days. They would come. The other work continued alongside this. Maeve spent 2 days going through the county title records more systematically than she had the first time, now that she knew exactly what shape to look for. She found 2 additional properties whose transfer of title had gone through River Basin Holdings properties. She hadn't caught on the first pass because they were listed under a slightly different spelling of the holding company name, the kind of variation that looked like a clerical error and was almost certainly not one. She brought this to Rourke on a Tuesday evening. He looked at the records. He looked at the modified company name. Garrett, he said. The variation creates just enough ambiguity to slow down anyone connecting the acquisitions, Maeve said. If you're looking for River Basin Holdings, you don't automatically find River Basin Holdings singular. No's. They're filed separately, different registration numbers. How many properties total now? Rourke asked. 9. Possibly 10. There's one I haven't fully traced yet. She paused. The important thing is not the number. The important thing is the pattern. 9 properties acquired through the same mechanism by entities that all trace back to the same registered agent across a span of 15 years is not a series of coincidences. It's a system. Rourke was quiet for a moment, looking at the records. Does Aldrin have the authority to act on this, or is this something that needs a higher court? Aldrin's authority in this proceeding is limited to the specific dispute about the river rights agreement, Maeve said. But if I present the full pattern and the documentation is solid enough, 2 things happen. First, it establishes that the agreement Belrose is trying to enforce was part of a systematic practice, which undermines the legitimacy of the agreement itself. Second, she paused. It goes into the public record. And once something is in the public record of a legal proceeding, it becomes available to anyone with a claim to pursue. Rourke looked at her. You're not just trying to win the hearing. I'm trying to make sure that when the hearing is over, Belrose can't simply move on to the next family, she said. Winning our case and leaving the mechanism intact doesn't help the Denisons. It doesn't help the Briggs. It means someone else is next. She looked at the records in front of her. I'm not willing to do all of this and settle for half. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression she had come to recognize the look of a man reassessing, not the original assessment, but the accumulated one. Adding the present moment to everything previous and arriving at something larger than any single piece. No, he said, we don't settle for half. On the 12th day, Cornelius Garrett made a mistake. He came to the ranch. He came in the early afternoon when Rourke was out on the range, and only Maeve and Agatha were in the house, which was almost certainly not a coincidence. He was a thin man in his 40s, with the careful dress of someone who wanted to project competence, and he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and asked if he could speak with Mrs. Halstead. Agatha looked at Maeve. Maeve said yes. They sat in the front room. Garrett did not appear comfortable sitting. He perched at the edge of the chair and held his hat with both hands, and spoke with the measured calm of a man delivering a prepared message. Mr. Belrose asked me to convey, Garrett said, that the continuation hearing could be simplified considerably if Mrs. Halstead would be willing to discuss the scope of the documentation she intends to present. Maeve looked at him pleasantly. Simplified how? There may be room for a resolution that addresses Blackthorn Basin situation without requiring the public presentation of records that could be, he chose his word carefully, misinterpreted. What kind of resolution? Maeve said. Mr. Belrose would be willing to restructure the river rights agreement on terms that don't require the marriage condition, Garrett said. A direct financial arrangement, properly negotiated, that would remove the dispute entirely. Maeve looked at him for a moment, and in exchange for this restructured arrangement, the documentation you've gathered regarding Mr. Belrose's other business relationships would remain private. The room was very still. Mr. Garrett, Maeve said, in the same pleasant tone, I want to make sure I understand what you're offering. Mr. Belrose will release Blackthorn Basin from the original agreement's terms if I agree not to present in a legal proceeding documentation that I have gathered legally about his business practices. Garrett's hands tightened on his hat. That's a pointed way to characterize. Is it accurate? A pause. The intent is to find a resolution beneficial to all parties. Maeve stood up. Please tell Mr. Belrose that I appreciate him sending you, and that Blackthorn Basin is not interested in a private resolution. She kept her voice entirely even. And Mr. Garrett, I'd like you to understand that this conversation, including the offer you've just made, will be described in writing to Magistrate Aldrin before the continuation hearing. She paused. Good afternoon. Garrett left without saying anything further. He had the look of a man who had delivered a message and received back something he hadn't been prepared for and was now going to have to explain it to someone who would not be pleased. Maeve went directly to the study and wrote down everything Garrett had said, word for word, as close as her memory could reconstruct it. She dated and signed it. She put it with the documentation. Then she sat there for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and let herself feel, briefly, the thing she'd been not quite feeling since the first hearing. Not triumph, it was too early for triumph, and she was too practical for it anyway. Something closer to the particular cold clarity that arrives when you understand that an opponent has just told you, through their own action, that they are frightened. Belrose was frightened. That meant the documentation was stronger than he'd expected. That meant she had built something real. She allowed herself 30 seconds with that. Then she picked up her pencil. The night before the continuation hearing, Franklin Denison arrived in Red Willow. He came by train with Eleanor, and Rourke arranged for them to stay at a boarding house near the town hall run by a woman named Patterson, who had no connection to Belrose's financial network Maeve had checked. She and Rourke went to meet them that evening. Franklin Dennison was 61 years old and moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had informed him that it required more attention than it used to. He had a rancher's hands, large and weathered, and eyes that had the specific quality of someone who has been through something and is still, some years later, in the process of finding where to put it. Eleanor was compact and direct, and had clearly been the one holding things together for 3 years, and she held them together now with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom it had become as natural as breathing. They sat in Patterson's front room, and Maeve spread the documentation on the table and went through it with both of them, not to persuade them they were already persuaded. They had been persuaded for 3 years, but to make sure they understood what they were walking into. "The proceeding tomorrow will be formal," Maeve said. "Belrose's lawyer is going to challenge the relevance of every document I present. He's going to argue that your payment records are incomplete or improperly maintained. He may say things about the Dennison operations management that are designed to suggest the default was your fault." Franklin looked at her steadily. "It wasn't," he said. It was the first thing he had said since they sat down. "I know that," Maeve said. "The records know that. But I want you to be prepared for someone to say otherwise in a room full of people." Eleanor put her hand on Franklin's arm. "We've been prepared for 3 years," she said quietly. "We just didn't have anywhere to take it." Rourke, who had been quiet through most of this, looked at Franklin Dennison with an expression Maeve recognized the particular directness of a man speaking to another man about something that does not require ornamentation. "I should have done this sooner," Rourke said. "I want you to know that. I knew something was wrong, and I didn't have what I needed to act on it, but I also didn't look hard enough for what I needed. I'm sorry for that." Franklin looked at him for a moment. "You're looking now," he said. That was all he said. But the way he said it carried the weight of a man deciding to extend something he had not been sure he still had available to extend. They left the Dennisons at 9 that evening and drove back to the ranch in the dark. The night was clear and very cold, the particular cold of early spring in Montana that arrives as a reminder that the season has not yet fully committed. Stars sharp overhead, the road familiar enough by now that Maeve could feel the turns before they came. "He's a good man," Rourke said, meaning Franklin Dennison. "Yes," Maeve said. "It shouldn't have taken 3 years." "No," Maeve said. "It shouldn't." She looked at the road ahead. "That's the thing about systems like Belrose's. They work because isolation is part of the design. Chester Briggs didn't know about the Dennisons. The Dennisons didn't know about the Alcotts. Everyone experiences it as their own private failure, their own individual bad luck, and they carry it alone because that's what you do with failure. You don't advertise it." She paused. "The mechanism only becomes visible when someone lines up all the isolated cases in the same room." Rourke drove for a moment without speaking. "Is that what you've been doing your whole life? Lining up isolated cases?" She thought about that, honestly. "I've been doing accounts for people who couldn't afford to think about the big picture because the immediate problem was too pressing," she said. "I didn't line them up. I kept them separate because that's what the work required." She looked at her hands in her lap. "This is the first time I've had both the access and the reason to put them together." "And," he said, "and it turns out that when you put enough individual true things together, they stop being individual," she said. "They become something else, something that has to be addressed differently." He was quiet for a moment. "You should do this," he said. "Whatever form it takes. This is what you should be doing." She looked at him in the dark of the wagon. "Let's win tomorrow first," she said. He almost smiled. She could hear it in his voice when he said, "Yes, let's do that first." The continuation hearing drew more people than the first. Word had traveled it always did in small places, and Red Willow was a small place, despite how large it had felt to Maeve when she was delivering pies in January. People who hadn't been at the first hearing came to the second one because they had heard from people who had, and what they had heard was specific enough to make them want to see for themselves. The room was full before Magistrate Aldrin called it to order. Maeve sat beside Rourke's lawyer at the front table, with her documentation organized in the precise sequence she had spent 3 days finalizing. On the other side of the aisle, Belrose sat with his lawyer and Garrett and 2 bank officers, and his expression was the careful neutral of a man who had arrived at a proceeding intending to control it and was not entirely certain that was still possible. Aldrin opened by stating that following the submission of documentation from the first hearing, he had reviewed the materials and was expanding the scope of inquiry to include the questions raised regarding the broader pattern of lending practices. He said this in the dry procedural language of magistrates, but what it meant was that Maeve's argument had been heard and had been found worth pursuing. Belrose's lawyer objected to the scope expansion. Aldrin noted the objection and continued. Rourke's lawyer presented the marriage documentation first efficient, thorough, the legal foundation that established their standing in the proceeding. Then he yielded the table to Maeve. She had not slept well. She was aware of that as a physical fact in her shoulders and behind her eyes. She was also aware that this was the kind of tiredness that does not impair you so much as sharpen certain things, the way cold sharpens a morning, everything very clear, and with no softness to it. She began with the Dennison records. Walt Purdy presented them formally, attesting to their maintenance and accuracy over the full period of the Dennison loan. He was precise and unflappable under cross-examination, the kind of witness who is difficult to undermine because he is not trying to make an argument, only to describe what the records show. Belrose's lawyer tried 4 different angles. Purdy answered each one the same way by referring to the documents and describing what they said. Then Eleanor Dennison presented the family's payment records. She was not a trained witness, and she knew it, and she didn't try to be one. She simply described, in the clear, factual language of a woman who has gone over the same information 1,000 times in her own head, what payments were made, when, in what amounts, and how those payments compared to the bank's accounting of the debt. The gap was 14 months and roughly $340 in payments that had been made and not applied. Belrose's lawyer said the records could not be independently verified. Eleanor Dennison said, with the particular quiet of someone who has been waiting 3 years to say something in a room where it would be heard, then verify them. I have kept every receipt. I have the originals. What does the bank have? The room was very still. Aldrin asked Belrose's counsel whether the bank could produce their own payment records for the Dennison loan. Garrett, sitting behind the lawyer's table, shifted slightly. Belrose's lawyer said the bank records would need to be formally requested through the appropriate channel. Aldrin made a note. Maeve moved to the holding company structure. She presented the registration documents for River Basin Holdings and the parent entity, and the connection to Garrett's name, and the 9 properties she had traced through the structure. She presented the 2 variations in the company name as evidence of deliberate obfuscation rather than clerical error, supported by the fact that the variations appeared specifically on the files related to properties that had been the subject of legal challenges at some point in the transfer process. Belrose's lawyer argued that corporate structures were a normal feature of business. They are, Maeve said. This one is notable because its registered agent is simultaneously employed by the bank that originated the loans whose defaults led to the property transfers. That is a conflict of interest that is not disclosed in any of the loan documents signed by the borrowing families. She set the relevant pages on the magistrate's table. Every family that borrowed from Belrose's bank signed documents processed by Garrett. Every property that transferred through default went to an entity for which Garrett is the registered agent. The same person was on both sides of every transaction, without disclosure. The room buzzed. Aldrin called for quiet with a raised hand rather than a gavel. Chester Briggs spoke next. He had not prepared a speech. He told the room what had happened to his family in the plain, slightly halting language of a man who is not accustomed to public speaking, but is accustomed to truth. He talked about the loan and the payments and the statement that showed he owed more than he had borrowed. He talked about the night he couldn't sleep because he was trying to understand how the math worked and finally accepting that it wasn't going to work in his favor, regardless of what he did. He talked about his son Marcus working a second job in town to supplement the ranch income, trying to make up numbers that were never going to be made up. Marcus did not speak. He sat beside his father and let his presence say what words would have been insufficient to say. 3 other families presented their records or their testimony. Each one was slightly different in its details and identical in its shape. The room understood this. Maeve could feel it the moment when a collection of individual stories stops being a collection and becomes a pattern, and the pattern lands differently than any single story could. Belrose's lawyer fought every piece. He was good. He found technical objections, procedural questions, inconsistencies in documentation dates, ambiguities in language. He was doing what lawyers do when the facts are not going their way, which is attack the frame rather than the picture. He did it professionally and without apparent emotion, and Maeve respected the craft of it even while she was answering each objection with another document. And then something happened that she had not planned. Franklin Dennison stood up. He had not been scheduled to speak. Eleanor had presented their records. Franklin had sat beside her through all of it, hands folded, face still. That particular quality of a man who is present in a room, but also somewhere else at the same time. He stood up and Magistrate Aldrin looked at him, and Franklin said, "I have something I would like to say." Aldrin looked at both lawyers. Neither objected. Aldrin nodded. Franklin Dennison was 61 years old and had the voice of a man who had spent his life outdoors, which meant it carried without effort. He did not look at his notes because he did not have notes. "I am not going to talk about documents," he said. "My wife has done that, and she knows those records better than I do. I'm going to talk about something else." He paused. "We had that land for 22 years. My father worked it before me. My children grew up on it. I knew every fence line and every water source and every patch of ground that grew good grass and every patch that didn't. I knew that land the way you know a person you've spent your whole life with." He was quiet for a moment. "When we lost it, I got sick. My wife will tell you it was coincidence." "It wasn't coincidence. I got sick because I had spent 22 years building something, and then I sat in a lawyer's office and signed papers that said I was giving it back for a debt I had done everything right to pay. And I couldn't explain it, and nobody could explain it to me in a way that made sense, because the explanation was that someone had built the numbers to end that way, regardless of what I did." He looked at the room. "Not at Belrose, at the room, at the people. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm 61 years old, and I am past needing sympathy. What I'm asking is for someone to say out loud, in a room with a record, that what happened to us was not our failure. That it was done to us. That it was built to happen, and it was built by someone who is in this room right now." He sat down. The silence was the kind that is not empty. Belrose, for the first time since the proceeding began, looked like a man in a room that was not behaving the way he had arranged it to behave. Maeve presented the Garrett offer last. She described with the document she had written the day Garrett visited the substance of what had been proposed. The offer to restructure the River Rights Agreement in exchange for the documentation remaining private. Belrose's lawyer objected that this was hearsay and improper. Aldrin asked Maeve whether Garrett was present. Garrett was present. Aldrin asked Garrett directly whether he had visited Blackthorn Basin on the date in question. Garrett looked at Belrose. Belrose's face did not change. Garrett said yes. Aldrin asked whether the substance of the visit was as Maeve had described. A very long pause. Garrett said, in a voice that had changed in some fundamental register from the composed voice he had been using all morning. The offer was made on Mr. Belrose's direction. The room broke open. It took Aldrin several minutes to restore order, and when he did, Belrose's lawyer requested an immediate recess, which Aldrin granted. During the recess, which lasted 40 minutes, Maeve sat with Rourke and his lawyer at the front table and did not speak much. There was not much to say. The recess was not about their side of the argument. When they reconvened, Belrose's lawyer requested a continuance, more time, more procedure, more delay. Aldrin denied it. The proceeding had already been continued once, and the evidence before the court was sufficient to reach findings. Aldrin's findings took 35 minutes to deliver. He found that the river rights agreement between Maeve Hollstead and Thaddeus Belrose, while technically valid in its original form, was embedded in a pattern of business practice that included undisclosed conflicts of interest. Specifically, Garrett's dual role as bank officer and holding company agent, which constituted a material defect in the agreement's formation. He found that the marriage condition was a provision specifically designed to create a condition of impossible compliance, given the timeline and Rourke's circumstances. Meeting the condition legitimately would have required advanced knowledge of the clause that Belrose had deliberately prevented through the agreement's structure. He found that the Dennison payment records, cross-referenced against the bank's own available documentation, demonstrated a systematic misapplication of payments that could not be attributed to error. He invalidated Belrose's claim on the Blackthorn Basin river rights. He referred the broader pattern of lending practices, including the holding company structure and the Garrett conflict of interest, to the state banking authority for formal investigation. He noted for the public record that the documentation assembled by Maeve Halstead represented the most comprehensive and methodically maintained body of evidence he had encountered in a proceeding of this nature, and recommended that any affected families seeking to review their loan histories do so with the assistance of a qualified financial advocate. Then he adjourned. The room did not react immediately. There was a moment, maybe 3 seconds, where everyone absorbed what had been said. Then it came apart at the seams in the good way, the way rooms come apart when the weight that has been pressing down on them gets lifted suddenly. Chester Briggs put his face in his hands. Ida Briggs put her arm around him. Marcus stood up very straight and breathed. Eleanor Dennison turned to Franklin and said something Maeve couldn't hear from where she was standing. Franklin nodded. His eyes were wet and he was not trying to prevent it. Walt Purdy came forward and shook Maeve's hand. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. Rourke was beside her. She was aware of him as a warmth to her left, and she turned to look at him, and he was watching her with an expression that had given up being careful. "You did that," he said. "We did that," she said. He shook his head slightly. "No, I mean yes. But you," he stopped. He was not a man comfortable with this kind of articulation, and she had stopped expecting him to be. "I want to say it correctly, and I'm aware I'm not going to." "Then don't try," she said. "Not here." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded, and the look on his face was something she would carry with her for a long time, not triumph, not relief exactly, but the look of a man who has been carrying something alone for so long that the moment someone stands beside him and shares the weight registers as almost physical. Belrose left without speaking to anyone. His lawyer followed. Garrett followed last, and he had the particular walk of a man who understood that the ground had shifted and was not sure where it was now. That evening, back at Blackthorn Basin, something happened that was not dramatic. Agatha made dinner. Decker ate with them, which had somehow become normal over the past months, and 2 of the other senior hands came in late, and Agatha fed them too without commentary. Ruth had come out from town, Rourke having sent the wagon for her that morning before the hearing, and she sat at the kitchen table with the contained pleasure of a woman who has been watching something unfold and is deeply satisfied with the ending, without needing to say so loudly. They ate. They talked about the spring cattle work, which needed to begin in earnest within 2 weeks. Decker had concerns about the north pasture fence that had been a recurring problem, and Rourke and Maeve both had thoughts about it that were different from each other's and led to an argument that was resolved 15 minutes later, with a compromise neither of them had started with. Ruth watched this exchange with an expression Maeve recognized and chose not to respond to. Later, after the table had been cleared, and Agatha had retired, and Decker had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Ruth was in the guest room that had become quietly and without announcement her room over the past. Several months, Rourke and Maeve sat in the kitchen. The lamp was burning low. The fire in the stove had settled to coals. Outside, the night was doing what Montana nights did, enormous and clear and completely indifferent to whatever had happened in a town hall 30 miles away. What happens now, Rourke said, with Belrose. The investigation. That's not quick, Maeve said. The banking authority moves slowly. It could be a year before formal findings, longer before anything changes for the families who were affected. She looked at the cooling coffee in her cup. But the record is public. Other advocates can use it. Other families can reference it. She paused. It's not everything. But it's the thing that makes other things possible. Rourke nodded. He turned his cup in his hands the way he did when he was thinking, rather than when he was about to say something. I want to restructure the ranch finances, he said. Properly, not just patching the current problems. I want to do what you've been suggesting for months. Reduce the herd to sustainable numbers, formalize the cooperative arrangement with the neighboring ranchers, establish transparent bookkeeping that anyone who works here or depends on this place can look at. He looked at her. I want to build something that doesn't need to be rescued. That's going to take 2 or 3 years to fully implement, Maeve said. I know, he said. It's going to require some short-term losses before the long-term gains are visible. I know that too, and you'll need someone to manage the transition who understands both the land side and the financial side, Maeve said, because they have to move together, or you'll fix one and break the other. Rourke looked at her steadily. I have someone in mind. She met his eyes. Your year is almost up, she said. It came out more quietly than she intended. I know, he said. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The fire settled. The lamp flickered once and held. Maeve, he said. Don't, she said, not unkindly, not yet. Let me say something first. He waited. He was good at waiting when it mattered. She looked at her hands on the table. She had spent months looking at these hands with a pencil between them, or a ledger under them, or wrapped around a coffee cup in the early morning. She knew every callus, every ink stain, every scar. They were not the hands of a woman who had lived lightly. I came here because I didn't have a better option, she said. That's the honest version. The mortgage, Ruth's care, the timing, I didn't have a better option, and I knew it, and I made a pragmatic decision. She paused. What I didn't account for was the possibility that pragmatic decisions can lead somewhere they were not designed to go. She looked up at him. I have tried very hard not to make this complicated. To stay in the lane of the arrangement, to be useful without being invested, she paused. I am not unaware of the irony that the person who reorganized everyone else's accounts could not keep her own separate. Rourke said nothing. He was listening with his whole body in the way she had come to recognize, absolutely still, everything focused. I don't want to leave, she said. Not the ranch. Not the work, not, she stopped, started again. Not this. Whatever this is, I don't want to leave it. He reached across the table. Not dramatic, not staged. He put his hand over hers on the table, the same hand she had bandaged in this same kitchen in what felt like a different winter, and he left it there. Don't, he said. It's not that simple, she said. No, he said, it isn't, but it's also not more complicated than two people deciding. She looked at his hand on hers. She thought about the line cabin and the blizzard and what it felt like to be seen without having performed anything to earn it. She thought about 41 families and the Dennisons and Chester Briggs putting his face in his hands when the finding was announced. She thought about Ruth in the guest room that had quietly become her room. I'm not easy to live with, she said. I should tell you that plainly. I know, he said, and the lack of argument in his voice made it sound like something other than a concession. Neither am I. We've had significant disagreements in the last 3 months. We have, he said. We were right about half of them each. Roughly. She almost laughed. It came out as something caught between a laugh and a breath. That's a generous accounting. I'm inclined to be generous tonight, he said. She turned her hand over under his. Their fingers found the arrangement that felt natural, which was not a metaphor she would have allowed herself 3 months ago, but which she allowed herself now because she had earned the right to let things be what they were. Your year contract, she said. I intend to burn it, he said. She looked at him. When? "Whenever you're ready to watch it go," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Ask me properly," she said. "When you're ready. Not tonight. Tonight is too full of other things. But when it's just this, ask me properly." "I will," he said. He did 2 weeks later. The spring had arrived in the genuine way by then, not the false warmth of March, but the actual turning, mud and new grass, and the particular loudness of the creek that ran through the east pasture when the snowmelt came down from the high range. The cattle work was in full motion. Decker was managing the North Pasture Fence project. The cooperative arrangement with 3 neighboring ranchers had been formally documented and signed, with Maeve's bookkeeping structure as the basis. Ruth had decided, without making a formal announcement about it, that the guest room at Blackthorn Basin suited her considerably better than the house on Larimer Street, which was currently being rented to a family that needed it and could now afford it because their debt situation had been reorganized following the hearing. The medical care had improved. The color in her face had improved with it. Rourke took Maeve out to the east pasture on a Tuesday evening, which was an unremarkable choice of day, and an unremarkable choice of place, just the pasture she had ridden through 100 times. The creek running loud beside them, the last of the day's light on the hills. He had the original contract in his coat pocket, which she didn't know until he took it out. He showed it to her without explanation. Then he took his lighter from his pocket, a battered thing he used for the stove, and held the corner of the paper to the flame. They watched it burn together. It took less time than she expected. Paper always did. When it was ash, he put the lighter away and turned to face her. He was not comfortable with this kind of thing. She knew that about him well enough, now that she could see the specific quality of the discomfort, not reluctance, but the effort of a man to whom eloquence does not come naturally, trying to find language sufficient to something he felt deeply. "I'm not going to make this into a speech," he said. "Good," she said. "I love you," he said. "I don't know exactly when that started or whether it started from something I should be proud of, because the beginning of it is complicated by what I've already admitted to you. I know what it is now. I know that what I want is you here, not because the arrangement requires it, and not because you're useful though you are, considerably, but because the version of this life that includes you is the version I want." He paused. "Will you stay? Not as a contract, as a choice." She looked at him in the fading April light with the creek loud beside them, and the hills doing what Montana hills do, and the ash of the original contract somewhere on the ground behind them. "Yes," she said. He stepped forward and kissed her, finally. After 4 months of careful navigation, and shared breakfasts and blizzards and document boxes and hearings, and 41 families and 9 wrongfully acquired properties, and 1 lamp that burned in a study laid into the night more times than either of them could count. It was not a perfect kiss. He moved slightly wrong at first and then corrected, and she had thought about this moment considerably less practically than she had thought she would, and was, therefore, slightly underprepared for how different it was from imagining it. It was clumsy for a moment in the way of 2 people who have been very careful with each other for a long time and are putting the careful down for the first time. And then it was not clumsy, and then it was just true, which was the only word she had for it. In the years that followed, Blackthorn Basin became a different kind of operation, not different in what it was, which was a cattle ranch in a Montana valley, run by people who worked hard and expected the same from the land, but different in how it understood itself. The cooperative arrangement with the neighboring ranchers formalized into something that protected 4 operations instead of 1. The bookkeeping Maeve established became a model that 2 other valley communities adapted for their own use. And this was not because anyone planned it that way, but because people who understood they had been taken advantage of were hungry for tools that made advantage-taking harder. The state banking authority's investigation into Belrose's practices took 14 months. At the end of it, 3 formal findings were issued. Garrett lost his banking license, and 2 of the 9 properties transferred through River Basin Holdings were subject to title review. The Denison land was one of them. The review process was long and imperfect, and Franklin Dennison's health did not allow him to work the land again even when it was returned. But Eleanor told Maeve in a letter 2 years later that Franklin had gone out to stand on it the day the title transferred back, and that he had stood there for a long time, and that had been enough. Belrose himself retained enough insulation through the corporate structures that he avoided criminal prosecution. This was a frustration. Maeve carried for a long time the gap between what the law could prove and what had actually happened. She was not, ultimately, a person who could make peace with that gap by pretending it didn't exist, so she did not try. What she did instead was continue to make the documentation available, to work with families who came to her with loan documents they couldn't understand, to build a record that outlasted her own immediate need for it. This was, she understood as time went on, what Ruth had meant when she'd said that some people find the thing they're for. Not a comfortable thing, not a perfect fit, not without cost. Just the thing that uses what you actually have in the service of something that actually matters. Ruth lived at Blackthorn Basin for the rest of her life, which was longer than the doctors in Red Willow had predicted, a fact Ruth took considerable private satisfaction in. She was sharp until near the end, and she was, in the way of women who have seen a great deal and survived it, very good company. Maeve never fully stopped being the woman who came in through the delivery entrance. She was aware of that. There were still rooms in Red Willow and in the wider world where she felt the old pull of insufficiency, the old instinct to keep her eyes down and move quickly. She did not always succeed in ignoring it. She was not that kind of person, the kind who heals completely and never looks back. She was the more ordinary kind, who carries what she came from and chooses, most days, not to let it make the decisions. Rourke was not a perfect husband. He was still private in ways that required effort to work around. He still defaulted to handling things alone when he should have talked first, and this caused arguments that were occasionally loud and always resolved, but were not nothing in the meantime. He was better than he had been. She was better than she had been. That was what marriage was in her experience of it. Not the arrival at a better version of yourself, but the slow, ongoing process of becoming one, with another person's honest witness as both pressure and support. One morning in the 3rd year, Maeve was at the desk in the study, the same desk, the same lamp, now burning in daylight because the habit of early mornings had never left her, and she was working through the accounts of a family from the North Valley who had come to her with a loan document they couldn't parse, and she had just found the thing buried in the 4th page, the clause that changed everything about what they thought they had signed, and she felt the familiar cold clarity of it land. She wrote it down. She wrote the explanation. She wrote what it meant in practical terms and what the family's options were, in language that a person who was not trained in finance could read and understand. She thought about herself at 28, standing in the Silver Heart Hotel ballroom with empty pie tins in a basket, hot-faced and furious, and completely unaware that the most dangerous and consequential thing in that room was not Corinne Belrose's voice, or the collective gaze of 60 people, or even Rourke Halstead crossing the floor toward her. It was the fact that she already knew how to do this. She had always known. She had just never had the room to do it at the scale it needed to be done. That was the thing about doors. Sometimes you entered through the wrong one and spent years apologizing for it. And sometimes you entered through the wrong one and eventually understood that the door had never mattered. What mattered was what you did once you were inside. She picked up her pencil and kept working.